It was the summer of 2014 when I decided to take a long solo hiking trip through a remote stretch of public forest land near the California-Oregon border. I'd been backpacking and hiking regularly for years and had seen my fair share of intense stuff. Black bears cutting across trails, a mountain lion that stalked me for a half-mile in Utah, sudden lightning storms in Colorado that nearly made me believe I wouldn't make it back. But none of that compared to what I walked into that summer. My friend Mark and I had been looking for somewhere new to hike. We'd heard through a few folks that the northern Siskiyou wilderness had some underused trails that led into untouched valleys and alpine ridgelines. It wasn't technically a national park, and that was the appeal. Fewer rules, fewer people. It was just past early July, the weather had warmed up, and the snowpack had melted enough to make most routes accessible. We took a few days off work, packed light, and hit the road from our town in southern Oregon. We were both in our late 20s at the time, still thinking we were invincible, still doing things like this without much backup or notifying more than one person where we'd be. The trailhead was unmarked. We found it off a dusty forest road that felt like it hadn't seen a grader in years. The road was narrow, more ruts than road in some stretches, and our old Tacoma rattled hard on the climb in. Eventually, we reached a widening in the road where it looked like other people had parked. No signs, no posted maps, just a faint trail dipping into the trees. That was the kind of hiking we liked. We left the truck around noon with the plan to do about 8 miles out, camp by a stream we'd seen on satellite maps, then return the next day. It was all forest, thick second-growth Douglas fir and some towering old pines that had somehow been spared the chainsaws. The trail itself disappeared in places, then reappeared a few yards later. It was obvious this wasn't maintained, but it also wasn't overgrown enough to be totally lost. Maybe a few locals used it for hunting or camping. We made good time that first leg, stopping only to refill water and get some calories in. It was quiet, too quiet in some ways. I hadn't seen any squirrels, no birds. Mark mentioned it once, just kind of an offhand comment, and we both shrugged it off. Sometimes areas like that had strange pockets of silence. Around mile 5 or 6, the trail started climbing hard. We gained maybe 800 feet over the next mile, switchbacking through some loose rock and chaparral. It was brutal in the sun, and by the time we hit the ridge, we were soaked in sweat. But the view made it worth it. You could see everything. Jagged peaks to the east, green valleys stretching wide to the west. No signs of people anywhere, just wild country. We dropped down the other side, heading toward a narrow valley that funneled into a wider basin below. According to our GPS, the creek we planned to camp by was about another mile down. The trail here was almost non-existent. Felt like no one had hiked that stretch in years. We bushwhacked a bit, trying to keep to a faint deer trail that paralleled the slope. That's when we crested a small hill and everything changed. At first I thought it was just a weird clearing, maybe a patch cleared by fire or logging a decade back. But then I noticed the green wasn't natural. It wasn't ferns or shrubs. It was rows of plants. Bright green, bushy, dense plants that looked way too uniform for anything wild. I froze. Mark stopped just behind me. We stepped forward maybe 20 more yards before the whole valley opened up in front of us. It was massive. Rows of marijuana plants, stretching out in every direction. At least a few hundred yards wide and easily twice that long. There were black irrigation hoses running like veins between them, coiled in precise loops and branching out toward large black plastic tanks, tucked behind some low netting that looked like camouflage. The reservoir was partially hidden by stacked brush and netting, but I could still make it out. The plants were full-grown, easily 5 or 6 feet tall. There were makeshift structures too, maybe tents or storage sheds built from wood and tarps. A generator hummed quietly somewhere in the distance, nearly drowned out by the sound of the wind through the trees. It was a full-blown grow operation, and not the kind run by hobbyists or medical card holders. This was something else. I felt it immediately, that sense of danger that hits you before you even understand why. I'd never felt it that strong before. My skin went cold. Mark looked at me without saying a word. We both knew this wasn't a place we were supposed to be, and the people running this, whoever they were, probably didn't want witnesses. We turned around fast, didn't even try to cover our tracks. We needed to get back over the ridge. I kept expecting a voice to yell out, or worse, a gunshot. Every branch snap behind us made my heart jump. Every shift in the trees felt like eyes. It was the longest mile of my life climbing out of that valley. We didn't stop. We didn't talk. We just climbed. Back on the ridge, we paused for just a second to catch our breath. That was a mistake. There were fresh boot prints, not ours. Bigger, deeper, coming from the opposite direction. Someone had been there recently. Maybe they still were. I could feel my pulse in my teeth. We scrambled the next few miles like animals running from fire. I didn't care that we were making noise. I wanted out of there more than anything. When we finally reached the truck, the sun was dropping low. The Tacoma looked untouched. We jumped in, didn't bother changing clothes or drinking water. We just drove. That road out felt even longer than when we came in. Only when we hit paved road again did I let out a breath. Mark looked over once, nodded, and we kept driving in silence. We didn't call the sheriff, didn't report anything. I wish I could say we did, but out there, those places aren't always safe to report. You don't know who's in on what. Locals sometimes warn hikers to avoid certain areas for a reason. We never went back. I stuck to marked trails after that for a long time. That trip changed something in me. It wasn't just fear. It was the realization that the woods can hold more than just wildlife and weather. People build empires out there, far from the law, and they protect them however they see fit. What scared me most wasn't the plants or the setup. It was how invisible it all was. No signs, no fences, no warning. You could just be out for a hike, minding your business, and walk into something you were never meant to see. I still hike. I still love the quiet of the woods. But now I look a little closer at the maps. I pay attention to those odd silences. And I never again assume I'm alone out there, no matter how far from the road I get. I had just graduated college a few weeks earlier and moved to a small mountain town in north-central Wyoming for my first job out of school. I didn't know anybody there. No friends, no family, just me and my tiny one-bedroom apartment. The job wasn't bad. I worked for the Forest Service doing mostly data entry and some occasional trail mapping. I was glad to have something stable, but outside of work, my life was quiet. Too quiet. I spent most of my evenings watching TV or walking around the edge of town alone, trying to get familiar with the area. I'd always liked hiking. Back in school, I used to take weekend hikes around the nearby state parks. Nothing too wild, but enough to feel like I was getting away from people. Now that I was out here, surrounded by mountains, rivers, and wilderness, I figured it was a good time to explore a little more. It was the middle of August. That Saturday, the sun was out, and the sky was clear. A dry, sharp heat had settled in early that morning. I'd heard from one of the older guys at work about an old herding trail up in the Wind River Range, not far from town. It wasn't an official hiking trail, more of a path that ranchers and sheep used years ago. He didn't recommend it, said it was rough, unmarked, and overgrown. But that kind of made it sound better to me. I wasn't looking for a popular trail where I'd pass families or tourists every half mile. I wanted something quiet, out of the way. So that morning I packed up a few things: water, granola bars, a multi-tool, a light windbreaker, and a basic first aid kit, and drove up a rough forest road for about 30 minutes before parking by a locked gate. From there, I started walking. The old trail wasn't obvious, but I had studied some maps and Google Earth beforehand. It roughly followed a narrow stream called Arrowhead Creek, which cut through a thin, winding canyon before opening up into a broad meadow lined with spruce trees. The first part of the hike was fine. It was about 85 degrees, and I wore pants because I was paranoid about ticks. The path was overgrown with waist-high grass and wildflowers, with the occasional fallen log or patch of loose rock. Every now and then I had to climb around or duck under thick brush. I didn't mind it. The further I went, the more beautiful it got. The sound of the stream was steady and cool, even though I was sweating hard. The tall grass along the bank swayed in the breeze, and I could see trout darting in the clear water. It felt untouched. I hiked for maybe an hour and a half, slowly gaining elevation. The trail had long since disappeared, and I was basically bushwhacking at that point, but I kept the stream on my left and figured I could follow it back easily enough. Around midday, I came to a bend in the river that made a kind of natural alcove in the trees. It was shaded, and the water pooled a little deeper there. It looked perfect. I hadn't seen or heard anyone all day, and I doubted anyone even knew where I was. I hadn't told anyone, which, in hindsight, probably wasn't smart. I was sweating so bad that even the backs of my knees were soaked. My shirt stuck to me, and my socks were damp from the grass. The water looked almost too good. I couldn't resist it anymore. I stepped behind a tree, peeled off my clothes, and left them in a little pile on a sun-warmed rock. Then I walked straight into the stream. The water was so cold it took my breath away. I hadn't expected it to be that deep either. Within a few steps, it was at my waist, and a few more steps took it up to my chest. The icy shock spread through my arms and legs, and for a second I couldn't breathe. Then I relaxed into it. It was quiet out there, just the sound of the water trickling past rocks and the breeze rustling the spruce needles. I floated for a bit, let myself soak and cool off. After maybe 5 minutes, I got curious about what was around the next bend. The stream curved sharply to the left up ahead, and I hadn't seen much past it when I first arrived. I figured I might as well look. I was already in the water and still naked. Felt a little wild, but also kind of thrilling. So I started wading through the deeper section of the creek, keeping my steps slow and steady to avoid splashing. It was cold enough that I could feel the ache in my bones, but I didn't want to get out just yet. I moved carefully, the water lapping at my shoulders. As I reached the curve, I leaned forward a bit and peeked around the corner, trying to stay quiet. I didn't see much at first. More trees, a few large rocks jutting out of the bank, and some tangled brush. Then I saw something move, a shape, big, brown. I blinked. It was a moose, a bull, massive, its wide antlers catching glints of sunlight through the spruce trees. It stood in the water just 50 feet from me, drinking slowly, completely unaware of my presence. I didn't move. I don't even think I breathed. I just stood there in chest-deep water, frozen. My heart pounded in my throat. I knew enough about moose to know they're not gentle giants, especially not bulls, and especially not when surprised. My mind went blank for a moment. I couldn't think. Then the panic hit me like a tidal wave. My arms went stiff. My chest felt tight. I turned slowly, trying not to splash, not to make a ripple, not to let him see me. I started moving back the way I came, slowly at first, then quicker. I tried to stay quiet, but every time I exhaled, a small whisper came out, "I don't want to die," over and over. I didn't even realize I was saying it until I was halfway back to where I'd left my clothes. I think it was just instinct, panic speaking out loud. Once I got to the bend, I stopped wading and splashed out of the creek as fast as I could. I stumbled onto the rocky shore, water dripping from every part of me, heart pounding in my ears. I didn't look back. I grabbed my clothes in a ball and took off running barefoot through the woods, completely naked, pushing branches aside, scraping my feet on rocks and twigs. I didn't care. My brain was screaming at me to get out. I must have run for at least 100 yards before I stopped behind a tree and yanked on my underwear and shoes. I didn't even bother with my pants at first. I just wanted something between me and the forest floor. After a few more seconds, I threw my shirt over my shoulder, stuck the rest of my clothes under my arm, and kept moving. The hike back was a blur. I didn't follow the same path exactly. I didn't care about staying on track. I just knew the general direction of the car and aimed for it like my life depended on it. I wasn't walking anymore. I was half jogging, crashing through the brush, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. My mind kept running through worst-case scenarios. What if the moose had seen me and followed? What if I slipped and broke my ankle out here, completely alone, half naked, no cell signal? What if I passed out from exhaustion or heat stroke or just plain panic? Eventually, after what felt like hours, I saw the slope of the ridge I had crossed earlier, then the open stretch of forest road. Then my car, parked just behind the locked gate, right where I had left it. I nearly collapsed when I saw it. I climbed inside, slammed the door shut, and sat in the front seat with my soaked clothes in my lap, shaking. My breathing was shallow. My muscles twitched. I looked at myself in the rearview mirror and barely recognized my own face. I stayed there for almost 20 minutes before I even thought about starting the engine. My skin was scratched, my legs bruised from crashing through the brush. My hands trembled as I reached for the keys. I finally turned the ignition, pulled out of that dirt lot, and drove home in total silence. That night, I took a long shower and lay on my bed with the lights off for a long time. I kept going over everything in my head. I wasn't injured. The moose hadn't chased me. I hadn't gotten lost. But the raw fear I felt out there was something I'd never experienced before. Not like that. Not alone. Miles from anyone. With nothing between me and nature but my bare skin. I never told anyone about what happened. It felt too strange, too intense to put into words. I stayed away from that area for a long time. I stuck to more official trails, places with markers and maps and the occasional hiker passing by. The kind of hikes that felt like adventures, not survival. Years later, I can laugh at the idea of me, totally naked, whispering, "I don't want to die," while splashing away from a moose. But at the time, it didn't feel funny. It felt like something had cracked open inside me. That awareness that out there, deep in the mountains, nothing cares who you are. Nothing even knows you exist. It's just you, your instincts, and whatever you come across. I still hike. I still love being out in the wild. But I carry a lot more respect now for the quiet places, for the unexpected. I always tell someone where I'm going. I bring more gear. I stay more alert. But more than anything, I never assume I'm alone out there. Because sometimes around a bend, just out of sight, there's something bigger than you. And it doesn't even need to know you're there to remind you that you don't belong. That reminder doesn't need to roar or growl. Sometimes, it just drinks from a river in total silence, while you freeze in fear and back away naked, praying that this isn't the way your story ends. I took a solo hiking trip back in late October of 2017. I was living in northern Oregon at the time, about 2 hours from the coast, and I'd been feeling stuck in my daily routine. The stress of work was piling up, and I had been having trouble sleeping. I thought maybe some time alone in the woods would help me clear my head. I picked a state forest I hadn't been to before, somewhere between Tillamook and McMinnville, far enough from the city that I wouldn't be surrounded by other hikers. It wasn't totally isolated, just less popular than some of the big-name parks. I packed my gear the night before, got up early, and hit the road around 6:30 in the morning. The drive was peaceful. There was some low fog hanging in the trees, and the air had that damp, earthy smell I love so much about Oregon. I stopped once at a gas station to grab some water and a granola bar and then drove the rest of the way without stopping. I reached the small gravel parking area by about 9:15. My plan was to take a long loop trail that covered roughly 12 miles. I figured I'd be back to my car before dark if I didn't waste too much time. The trail started out easy. It led through some younger forest at first. Lots of underbrush, ferns, and thin trees. The air was chilly but not too cold, and I was warmed up within the first half hour. As I got further in, the trees got older, taller, and the light started to filter down in thinner and thinner patches. There was a constant soft crunch of dry leaves underfoot. Every now and then, a squirrel would dart across the trail or a bird would call out, but for the most part, it was quiet, peaceful. I had no cell service, which was exactly what I wanted. About 3 miles in, I stopped to drink some water and check the map I downloaded. I hadn't seen anyone else, and that didn't surprise me much. The trail wasn't listed as closed or anything, just not very trafficked. I kept walking, going deeper into the woods. It was around this time that I started hearing something faint in the distance. It was soft and spaced out, like a drawn-out note, echoing slightly through the trees. At first, I thought it might have been the wind whistling in a strange way, but the sound didn't match that. It had a melodic quality to it. As I walked further, it became more clear. It was a saxophone. Not a recording either, it had that imperfect, live sound to it with little inconsistencies and breathiness. Someone was actually playing a saxophone in the middle of the woods. I kept walking, and the sound got louder. It was kind of eerie, to be honest. Beautiful, but out of place. It wasn't jazz or anything upbeat. More like a slow, wandering tune. The notes stretched out long and low. It didn't feel like a performance. It felt more like someone just playing for themselves, alone. Eventually, I saw him. He was coming toward me on the trail, walking slowly, holding the sax to his mouth and playing as he moved. He was wearing a green army-style jacket, jeans, and hiking boots. Maybe in his mid-40s, bald on top, with a short gray beard. He looked like someone you'd see at a coffee shop reading poetry. He didn't stop playing as I approached. I nodded, and as I passed him, he finally paused and said something cheerful about it being a nice day for music. Then he kept walking back the way I came, playing that same slow tune. It was one of the weirdest things I'd ever seen. Not threatening, not even particularly creepy at that point, just bizarre. I almost laughed, wondering if I'd stumbled into some kind of art project or if this guy just did this as a hobby. I kept moving, glancing back once, and saw him disappear into the trees. The trail got steeper after that. It led up a ridge where the trees thinned out, and I could see down into a small valley. There was no sign of buildings or other people, just endless forest. I walked for another couple of hours without seeing anyone. The whole time, I had that saxophone tune looping in my head. I stopped for lunch on a fallen log near a little creek that crossed the trail. It was quiet, the kind of quiet where you can hear your own breathing and the occasional drip of water off a leaf. I sat there longer than I probably should have. Something about that music had put me in a weird mood. I felt like I had walked out of normal life and into something slightly off. I eventually kept moving. The trail wound back down toward the valley floor. The deeper I got, the darker it got. The tree canopy thickened, and I felt like I had entered a different world. I'm not someone who scares easily, but I started to feel watched. It wasn't a full-on panic, just a kind of creeping awareness. I kept looking behind me, half expecting to see that saxophone player again. A little past mile 8, I noticed something strange. A small cloth pouch was hanging from a branch at eye level, tied there with a bit of twine. It was just dangling there, like an ornament. It looked handmade. I stopped to look at it. It was dirty and faded, maybe full of herbs or small stones. I didn't touch it. Just seeing it there made my stomach knot a little. From that point on, the trail felt different. I kept seeing odd little things. Piles of rocks stacked carefully in the crook of trees. A circle of bark chips laid out on a stump. Stuff that looked intentional but subtle. Not trash or random debris, more like offerings or symbols. It wasn't a marked cultural site or anything. It felt personal, secretive. I didn't like it. It was about 3:30 when I started hurrying. I still had maybe 3 miles to go, and I wanted to be out of the woods before the light started fading. My nerves were getting worse. I didn't hear any more music, but every time I stopped to listen, the woods felt dead quiet. I started imagining that maybe the sax player wasn't just some weirdo enjoying nature. Maybe he was connected to all the strange stuff I was seeing. I moved faster than I probably should have. The trail was uneven in spots, and I almost twisted my ankle once. There were no other hikers, no distant sounds of cars or planes, just the constant crunch of my own steps and the occasional gust of wind. About 1.5 miles from the trailhead, I heard something again. Not music this time, just footsteps, off to the side, maybe 20 feet into the trees. They weren't fast, just deliberate, careful steps. I froze, looked around, didn't see anything. I waited a minute. The steps stopped. When I started walking again, they didn't come back. When I finally made it to the parking area, I was out of breath and sweating, even though it wasn't hot. My car was the only one there. I sat inside for a while, just breathing and trying to calm down. I didn't see the sax guy again. I didn't see anyone. I drove home in silence. No music, no podcast. I kept thinking about that tune he played, how out of place it felt, how weird the rest of the hike had gotten afterward. I told myself it was all coincidence, just some guy who liked to play music outdoors, and maybe some harmless art installations or spiritual stuff someone had left behind. But I didn't go hiking alone again for a long time after that. A couple months later, I mentioned the experience to a friend who lived nearby. She told me she knew the trail I was talking about. Said a few people she knew had hiked there and come back saying the same thing, that the woods felt off, that they'd seen weird handmade objects or felt like they weren't alone. One guy had even taken a picture of a guy playing clarinet out there. Not a saxophone, clarinet. I never went back. I stuck to more populated trails after that. I still don't know what that guy was doing out there or what all the strange things in the woods meant. I just know I didn't imagine it. And I know that whatever it was, I don't want to find out more. Some things, even when they're not dangerous or supernatural, are better left alone. It was the summer of 1998 when I found it. I was 14, living in a small town in northern Pennsylvania called Alder Run. Back then, our town had maybe 30 houses scattered over a 10-mile radius, and everyone knew everyone. My parents owned a small piece of land on the edge of the state forest, a patch of dense woods and overgrown logging trails that went on forever. Most kids spent their summer riding bikes or swimming in the creek, but I liked hiking alone. I liked the quiet. I'd go out early in the morning and try to make it back before dinner. No compass, no map, just memory and instinct. I knew those woods better than anyone my age. That morning started like all the others. I packed a water bottle and a peanut butter sandwich into my backpack, pulled on my boots, and headed out the back door before my mom even got up. I cut through the tall grass behind our shed and followed the overgrown deer trail that led into the woods. The air was thick and damp, the kind of morning where everything smelled like moss and wet bark. I had no real destination. I just wanted to explore. Maybe find a deer antler or an old rusted car frame that the forest had started to swallow. I followed a narrow trail for about half a mile before it opened into an old logging road. The forest here was older, full of tall hemlocks and dead leaves that muffled my footsteps. I kept going, turning off the path now and then just to see where smaller trails led. Time got away from me. Before I knew it, I had hiked 2 or 3 miles from my house. I didn't care. I had all day. Eventually, I noticed the air had changed. It wasn't just warm and humid anymore. There was something else in it, a smell. First, it was faint. I thought maybe it was just a dead raccoon or something deeper in the brush. Happens all the time out there. But the farther I walked, the stronger it got. It was thick and sour and clung to the inside of my nose. My stomach started to churn. The trail I was on curved around a hill and opened into a clearing with a rocky outcrop that jutted out over a steep drop. I walked to the edge and looked down. That's when I saw it. At the bottom of the cliff was a massive pile of dead deer. It wasn't just a couple. There had to be 30, maybe more. Their bodies were in different states of decay. Some were bloated, their fur peeling back to show greenish skin. Others were reduced to bone and hide. A few had their legs stiff and pointed at strange angles, like they'd been tossed carelessly. But the worst part, most of them were missing their heads. Some of the carcasses were small, fawns. Their spots were still faint on their sides. I gagged and stepped back from the ledge. The stench was overwhelming now, a thick wall of rot and blood. I didn't understand what I was looking at. I knew hunters. My uncle hunted. My neighbor down the road had taken me bow hunting once. But this wasn't hunting. This was something else. Something wrong. I turned to leave. I didn't want to see any more. That's when I heard it. The low growl of engines. ATVs. Close. Coming from somewhere behind the rise. I froze. My heart felt like it was caught in my throat. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't supposed to be there. I wasn't supposed to be that far out in the woods. I didn't even tell my parents I was hiking. I looked around and saw a thick hemlock tree about 15 feet from the cliff's edge. Its low branches were draped in green, almost like a curtain. I ducked beneath them and lay flat on the ground, pressing my chest into the dirt. My hands trembled. The ATVs came into view. 2 of them. The riders wore camo, full gear, face masks, gloves, everything. I didn't recognize them. That was strange. On that side of Alder Run, everyone knew everyone. You couldn't throw a rock without hitting someone you'd waved at in church or school or the market. But these men were strangers. They pulled up right to the edge of the cliff, maybe 10 feet from where I had been standing earlier. One of them hopped off and dragged 2 deer carcasses from a trailer hitched to the back of his ATV. He heaved the bodies over the edge like garbage bags. The thud of the carcasses hitting the pile below made my stomach twist. The other man lit a cigarette and leaned against his ATV, talking casually to the first. I couldn't hear what they were saying. I didn't want to. I barely breathed. I stayed like that for 10 minutes, maybe more. They didn't seem rushed. They smoked, talked. One of them urinated off the side of the cliff. Finally, they climbed back onto their ATVs and rode off the way they came, the growl of their engines fading into the trees. I didn't move until I couldn't hear them anymore. When I finally stood up, my legs were so weak they almost gave out. I didn't look over the cliff again. Couldn't. I just turned and ran. The trip home felt endless. Every snapping twig behind me made my skin crawl. I thought they might circle back. Thought they might find my footprints. I stuck to deer trails, ducked behind trees, and moved fast but low. I didn't stop until I was out of the woods and could see the back of our house through the tall grass. When I got inside, my mom was in the kitchen. I must have looked pale or shaken because she immediately asked what was wrong. I tried to explain. I told her everything about the deer, the smell, the men on ATVs. Her face hardened halfway through the story, not out of fear or concern, but anger. She was furious that I'd gone out so far on my own, said I could have gotten lost or hurt. I got grounded for the rest of the week. My dad didn't believe me either. He thought I was exaggerating or had stumbled on some old hunter's dump site from years ago. But I couldn't get it out of my head. I kept seeing those fawns, their small, limp bodies tossed into the pile like they were nothing. A few days later, I mentioned it to our neighbor, Rick. He was a serious hunter, the kind of guy who treated the woods like sacred ground. I didn't tell him everything, just that I'd found a pile of deer in a ravine out near the old logging roads. His face changed when I said it. He didn't say much, but I could tell he was concerned. A week after that, he told me he'd spoken to the game warden. They'd gone out there and confirmed what I saw. The dump site was real. It wasn't just a couple deer. It was dozens. No tags. Most of them decapitated. It was clear that whoever had been doing it wasn't following any hunting laws. They launched an investigation, but nothing ever came of it. No arrests, no names. The site was cleared eventually, and some game cameras were installed in the area, but the poachers never came back. At least not to that spot. I still think about that day, about how close I was to them. 15 feet. That's the distance from a couch to a TV. If they'd looked to their left, if one of them had wandered just a few feet into the brush, they would have found me. A skinny 14-year-old kid crouched in the dirt, eyes wide, heart racing. I never hiked out that far again. Not alone. I stuck to trails I knew, stayed within shouting distance of the house. It changed how I saw the woods. They weren't just quiet and peaceful anymore. They were hiding things, bad things. I never found out who those men were. They weren't from Alder Run. I'd bet anything on that. Maybe they were from the next town over, or maybe they drove in from hours away just to dump their kills. Either way, they got away with it. I'm 39 now, married, 2 kids, still living in Pennsylvania, but not in Alder Run. I still hike sometimes, but I carry a compass now, and a phone. I still like the quiet, but I never let myself get too far from safety. And if I smell something bad in the woods, I turn around and go home. I never saw anything like that again. I hope I never do. It was the middle of September in 2019. The air cool but not cold, just perfect for a long weekend trip out in the backcountry. My wife, Ellen, and I had planned this canoe camping trip months in advance. We both needed the escape. Life back in Cincinnati had been nonstop with work, obligations, and family stuff piling on. So we took off on a Friday morning and drove about 4 hours northeast to a secluded lake in Pennsylvania. The lake itself was long and narrow, about 1.5 miles in length and barely 50 meters across in most places. There were no roads along its shores, just a few spaced-out campsites reachable only by canoe or by hiking in from the surrounding forest trails. We parked at the small public access lot at the north end of the lake, loaded up our aluminum canoe with our packs, food barrels, and gear, and paddled out. The lake was calm, not a breath of wind, and the water shimmered in the afternoon sun. We took our time, soaking in the quiet, the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface, and the sound of our paddles slicing through the water. We stopped about halfway down the lake at site number 3, which was on the east shore. The site was perfect. A level clearing, flat ground for the tent, some logs set around a fire pit, and a good landing spot for the canoe. We spent the rest of the day setting up camp, gathering some deadfall for the fire, and enjoying the peacefulness of the place. Ellen started prepping dinner while I got the fire going. We ate just as the sun started dipping behind the trees. The light faded slowly, and by the time we cleaned up, it was getting pretty dark. The moon wasn't up yet, and the stars were just starting to show. After the dishes were done and our bear bag was hoisted into the trees, I decided to head down to the water to wash my face. The lake was completely still, black like glass, reflecting a sky full of stars. I crouched at the edge, splashed some cold water on my face, and just stayed there for a moment, listening. That's when I saw them. 2 small lights flickering through the trees across the lake, maybe 50 meters away, moving slowly along the shore. At first, I thought they were other campers with headlamps looking for a spot to pitch a tent. But something about how they moved was odd, uneven, erratic, like they weren't on a trail. One light dimmed a bit, then the other started flickering too, and within a few seconds, both went out completely. I stood there, waiting to see if they'd come back on. Nothing, just the dark forest across the water. Then I heard it, a loud, heavy snort, followed by some rustling, then another deep grunt or exhale. It echoed over the lake clearly. Whatever it was big. Maybe a bear, maybe a moose. I'd heard moose before, and this didn't sound quite the same. It was more of a huffing, deep kind of breath, not panicked, but powerful. It went quiet again. I stayed there a few minutes, scanning the shoreline across the lake, listening for anything else. I didn't hear the lights again. I didn't see them either, just more silence. I walked back up to the campsite and grabbed one of our stronger flashlights. Ellen was already in the tent reading, so I told her I was going to take the canoe out for a quick paddle. She didn't question it. I walked the canoe down to the shore, climbed in, and pushed off. The water was still like oil under the flashlight beam, totally flat, not a ripple. I paddled slowly, quietly, keeping my light trained ahead. It took only a few minutes to reach the other shore. As I got closer, I started calling out gently, letting whoever it was know someone was coming. I finally saw some movement just inside the tree line. 2 figures stepped out into the narrow clearing by the water's edge. A man and a woman, both probably in their late 20s or early 30s, stood there looking tired and nervous. The guy was carrying a mostly dead headlamp in his hand, and the woman had a pack on her back that looked like it had been bothering her for a while. They were both relieved to see me. Without saying anything, I gestured for them to get in. They climbed in carefully, the canoe wobbling slightly. Once they were settled, I turned us around and paddled back. The guy kept glancing back toward the trees. He was clearly uneasy. The girl sat very still. I didn't ask what they had seen or heard. The look on their faces said enough. Back at our camp, I handed them one of our spare flashlights. It was a good one, strong beam and long-lasting. I pointed them toward a decent flat spot behind some trees where they could set up without disturbing our area. They thanked me quietly, and I watched as they started unpacking and setting up their small backpacking tent. Ellen came out and asked me what happened. I told her the short version. 2 hikers had started from the wrong trailhead and ended up bushwhacking along the wrong side of the lake, no trail, no lamps, and nearly got stuck for the night. If I hadn't seen their lights flicker out, they might have been stuck out there in the dark with whatever that thing was breathing and snorting in the woods. The rest of the night passed without any more strange noises. We sat by the fire for a while, talking in low voices, then turned in. I kept the flashlight beside me in the tent, just in case. The next morning, we got up early. The couple was already packing up. They thanked us again, more awake now and more relaxed. They had a long hike ahead to get back to their car. I offered to paddle them up to the north end of the lake, where the main access was. It would save them at least a couple of hours of rough hiking. They accepted. Ellen stayed at camp while I took them up. We didn't talk much during the paddle. They just looked out over the water, still processing the night before. When we got to the landing, they unloaded, thanked me again, and started the walk to the parking lot. I watched them go, then turned back toward the middle of the lake. The paddle back was slow and quiet. I kept thinking about how close they had come to being in a really bad situation. No lights, no real trail, a big animal nearby. Could have gone another way easily. Back at camp, Ellen had coffee going. We stayed one more night, and everything was calm. No more strange noises, no lights across the water, nothing. Just the lake, the trees, and the quiet. We packed out the next day, paddled to the north end, and drove home. But even now, every time I wash my face at the lake on a calm night, I think about that moment. The silence, the two flickering lights, and the deep, heavy breathing coming from the woods. It still makes the hairs on my neck stand up. It was one of those moments that reminded me how quickly things can turn out there, how small you really are in the wild, and how sometimes being in the right place at the right time can make all the difference. It was early in the morning, somewhere around 5:30 a.m., when I pulled up to the trailhead just outside Hilo, Hawaii. The sun wasn't up yet, and the world still felt half asleep. I had flown out to the Big Island for a solo trip to reset after a tough year, work stress, a bad breakup, and too much time sitting at a desk had pushed me to my limit. I needed to get out, breathe some fresh air, and reconnect with something real. So I picked a rugged trail known for its sweeping views, mist-covered cliffs, and dense rainforest terrain. I was 32 at the time, still in decent shape, but not exactly an athlete. I had prepped well, though. Packed protein bars, water, a rain shell, first aid kit, bear spray, out of habit more than necessity, and my trusty headlamp. I figured I'd knock out a solid 6-hour hike and be back before lunchtime. As I stepped out of the rental car and into the cool morning air, everything was still. The smell of damp leaves, soil, and salt water filled my lungs. I took a few minutes to stretch and mentally run through my checklist. Everything was in order. I flicked on my headlamp, adjusted the straps on my pack, and started up the faint trail that cut through the trees. 10 minutes in, I felt that first stomach twinge. It was subtle at first, a gurgle, nothing major. I ignored it and kept moving, focusing on the rhythmic crunch of my boots on the gravel and the low hum of insects waking up. But within another 5 minutes, the feeling came back, stronger. My stomach twisted, and that unmistakable pressure started to build. I stopped walking, took a deep breath, and clenched. Not now, I thought. Another 5 steps and the pressure doubled. I knew this wasn't something I could walk off. I needed a bathroom, badly. I turned around and speed walked back toward the trailhead, half jogging while trying not to jostle things too much. The forest around me was thick and dark, and the only light came from the narrow beam of my headlamp. I was praying, not for a miracle, just for a porta potty. And somehow it was there, right near the edge of the gravel parking area, tucked beside a utility shed, stood a faded green plastic toilet with graffiti scratched into the sides and rust around the hinges. It looked old but serviceable. At that moment, it might as well have been a luxury suite. I yanked the door open and stepped inside. The smell was horrible, but I didn't care. I barely got the latch closed before I dropped my pack and scrambled to get my pants down. It was urgent, the kind of urgent where you forget how to breathe for a second. By some small grace, I made it in time. I sat there in the dark, catching my breath, elbows on my knees, trying to cool off. Sweat ran down my neck, and my legs trembled. The hard plastic seat was cold, and the humid air inside was suffocating. But for the moment, I had peace. After a few minutes, I started to collect myself. I reached into my pocket and turned my headlamp back on so I could find the toilet paper, which I hadn't even checked for when I rushed in. That's when I saw it. The beam of my headlamp landed on a massive spider clinging to the upper corner of the stall. Its legs were long and splayed wide, and the body was thick, about the size of my palm. It was a golden banana spider, maybe 5 inches across. Its legs were banded with black and yellow, and its body was thick and bulbous with a slight shimmer. It didn't move, not at first. I froze. I didn't scream, didn't flinch, just sat there, pants around my ankles, completely still. I had never had a huge fear of spiders, but this thing was on another level. It looked prehistoric, like something that should not exist outside of a horror movie. The toilet paper was on a roll about a foot beneath it, pressed into the plastic wall. Very slowly, I leaned forward, trying to move as little as possible. I reached my hand out, inch by inch, trying not to shake. My headlamp, still strapped to my forehead, followed the motion, and the light stayed locked on the spider. That must have been what set it off. Without warning, the spider exploded into motion. It moved like lightning, skittering in wild circles across the ceiling of the stall, then down the wall, then back up. My heart jumped straight into my throat. I started breathing fast, but I couldn't move. I was still sitting there, half naked, completely vulnerable. The spider dropped down, hit the ground, then sprang back up, this time aiming straight toward me. It all happened so fast. 1 second, it was a blur. The next, it was between my legs. I felt the legs brushing my thighs, then something shifting inside my underwear. I don't know how I didn't black out. I went completely still. My entire body locked up. My mouth hung open, but no sound came out. I felt a faint tickle along the inside of my thigh. It was in there. It was in my underwear. I didn't know what to do. I was in shock. If I moved wrong, it might bite. If I stayed still, it might crawl higher. So I started to wiggle, just tiny movements, back and forth, hips shifting, shaking side to side, hoping the motion would be enough to scare it off. My hands gripped the sides of the seat so hard that my knuckles turned white. I stared straight ahead at the door, praying to see that thing crawl out. Nothing. Instead, I felt it climbing. The sensation of those legs moving up my inner thigh will stay with me for the rest of my life. Every nerve in my body screamed. I couldn't take it anymore. I jumped up, screaming. I yanked the door open and stumbled out into the gravel, pants tangled around my knees. The cold morning air hit me hard. I must have looked insane. Flailing, yelling, hopping like I was on fire. I twisted and slapped at myself, trying to dislodge whatever was still crawling. But after a few seconds, I realized I couldn't feel anything anymore. The spider was gone. I spun in circles, looking around the gravel, then back at the porta potty. Nothing. No movement. No trace. It had disappeared. So had any trace of my dignity. I pulled up my pants, still shaking, and stumbled back to the rental car. I sat in the front seat with the door open, head hanging between my knees, trying to catch my breath. I felt like I just survived some kind of primal attack. 10 minutes later, I was still sitting there. The sun was starting to rise behind the trees, casting long golden light across the gravel. Birds were chirping. The world looked calm, innocent, completely unaware of what had just happened. Eventually, I got myself together. I changed into a fresh pair of shorts from my backpack, wiped the sweat off my face, and chugged half a bottle of water. I sat there for a while longer, thinking. I didn't go back on the trail that day. I drove to a nearby beach and just sat there watching the waves for a few hours, trying to reset. I didn't tell anyone about the spider, not my friends, not my family. What was I supposed to say? That I got ambushed by a giant spider in a porta potty and ran out screaming with my ass out? No thanks. But I never forgot. That image of it dropping, the feeling of its legs on my skin, the panic. I can still feel it all like it happened yesterday. It didn't bite me. It didn't stay with me. It just showed up, wrecked my morning, and vanished. The dignity I lost in that moment? Yeah, that's probably still in that porta potty. But hey, I survived. And now, every time I head out for a hike, I carry an extra roll of TP, a flashlight, and a healthy dose of paranoia. Because out there, in the dark corners of trailheads and rest stops, there's always a chance that something's waiting to ruin your morning in a way you'll never forget. And if you're ever hiking near Hilo, and you see a faded green porta potty by the trail, maybe just hold it a little longer. When I was 22, I had just dropped out of college and was drifting through the Pacific Northwest. It was 2003 and I had no real plan. I had a beat-up backpack, a sleeping bag, a few changes of clothes, and maybe $60 to my name. I didn't own a tent or even a reliable flashlight. Most of my money had gone into gas and cheap food. I'd been living out of my car, a rusted-out Toyota Corolla with over 200,000 miles on it. The check engine light had been on for months, and the muffler dragged on certain bumps. I had driven down the coast from Eugene, Oregon, sticking to back roads and small towns, eventually crossing into Northern California. I wasn't headed anywhere specific. I had heard from a guy at a truck stop that the redwood forests down near Mendocino were worth seeing. So I followed Highway 1, snaking along the coastline, then turned inland onto a winding two-lane road that led into the forest. By the time I got there, the sun was already dropping behind the hills. The light that filtered through the trees was golden and soft, hitting the trunks like warm butter. I found a dirt turnout and pulled over. There was no campground sign, just a narrow trail that looked like it hadn't seen much use. I figured it was good enough for the night. I didn't want to pay for a campground anyway. I packed up my sleeping bag and a large wool blanket I had picked up at a thrift store. I slung my bag over my shoulder and hiked in about a quarter mile until I found a flat patch of ground surrounded by redwoods. The trees were huge and old, their bark thick and furrowed. The air was damp and smelled like moss and bark and rot. I laid out the blanket, then spread my sleeping bag on top. I had no tent, so I figured the blanket would keep me off the cold ground a little. I crawled in, wrapped myself in another layer of fleece I carried for warmth, and laid there listening to the forest. It was a quiet night, but not silent. I could hear little noises, twigs snapping under small feet, distant owls, the hum of insects. I hadn't seen another person for at least an hour before pulling off the road. It made me feel both vulnerable and strangely free. There was no moon, but the stars poked through the black canopy above like tiny holes in velvet. I drifted off slowly, my body warm and tired. The air around me was cold and still. I remember pulling the fleece tighter around my shoulders and burying my face in the top of the sleeping bag. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I didn't know why. There was no noise, no movement that I could feel. Just that familiar alertness that comes from sleeping in an unfamiliar place. My eyes adjusted slowly. Everything was dark. I fumbled for the small flashlight I kept in the pocket of my bag. It was a plastic hand crank model I had picked up for $5 at a convenience store. I gave it a few turns until the dim yellow bulb flickered on. When I aimed it at the edge of my blanket, I froze. All around the perimeter of the blanket, there were spiders. Dozens of them, maybe more. They were long-legged and black, each one maybe the size of my palm if you counted the legs. They stood still, leg to leg, forming a jagged living ring around me. None of them were moving. They weren't coming toward me. In fact, they were facing outward. At first I thought I was hallucinating. I blinked several times and shined the light along the edge of the blanket again. They were real, each one spaced a few inches from the next, all pointing away from the center. I stared for what felt like forever. My breath slowed, and I barely dared to move. I didn't recognize the species, but they weren't tarantulas. Their legs were too thin, too delicate, but they weren't daddy long legs either. Their bodies were sleek, their stance alert. It was like they were guarding me, or guarding something, or waiting. After a minute of trying to understand what I was seeing, I realized I wasn't in immediate danger. They weren't crawling on me or toward me. I figured maybe they were hunting. Maybe my body heat or the scent of the blankets had drawn smaller insects, and these spiders were just opportunists. Maybe this was just nature doing its thing, and I had nothing to do with it. That thought helped. Still, I was too nervous to move. I slowly pulled the fleece tighter around myself and tucked it beneath my sleeping bag. I left the flashlight on for a while, shining it gently over the ring of spiders until my hand grew tired. Then I shut it off, trusting the dark to hide what I didn't want to see. Sleep was slow to come, but it did. I drifted in and out, waking once to the faint rustle of something nearby, but I didn't turn the flashlight back on. I didn't want to see more. I just lay there, curled up tight, heart thudding in my chest. Eventually, sunlight filtered through the redwoods, casting golden streaks across the forest floor. When I sat up, the first thing I noticed was how still everything looked. The cool morning air hit my cheeks. I brushed pine needles from my blanket and looked around. No spiders, not one. I checked the edges of the blanket, the nearby ground, even the underside of my sleeping bag. Nothing. It was like they had never been there. No trace, no webbing, no carcasses, just the soft blanket laid out on the pine needle carpet. I packed up slowly, checking everything before rolling it tight and stuffing it into my bag. I stood there for a while, staring at the spot. The redwoods stood silent and tall, as if nothing had happened. I felt both foolish and oddly unsettled. Maybe it had been a dream, but I remembered turning the flashlight on, seeing the light shimmer on those long legs. I remembered the stillness of them, the way they faced outward like guards. You don't dream that kind of detail. I hiked back out the way I came. My car was still there, dusty and crooked on the turnout. I got in, turned the key, and it started after a few tries. I didn't say anything to anyone about the spiders for years. It seemed like one of those things that nobody would believe. It wasn't dramatic enough to be a horror story. It wasn't dangerous, just deeply, uncomfortably strange. Years later, I was living in a small apartment in Colorado, working nights at a grocery store. One night after work, I looked up different spider species from Northern California out of curiosity. I never found anything that matched what I saw. Not exactly. The closest was a kind of wandering spider, but their behavior didn't line up. They weren't communal, they didn't sit in rings, and they weren't known for anything like what I had seen. I stopped looking after that. I still go hiking, still sleep under the stars when I can. I carry better gear now, a tent, a real flashlight, bug spray. I still think about that night sometimes. The silence, the ring of spiders, the fact that they were gone by morning without a trace. It never scared me the way you might think. It just stayed with me, like a moment outside of time, something nature allowed me to witness just once. And that was enough. I've always liked being out in the woods, even though some people think it's weird. Growing up, my family lived on a farm near a dense forest. It was something I got used to, spending time outside, walking the trails, and just being alone in nature. But there was one time just a few years ago when I found myself walking in those woods at night that I learned how quickly everything can change when you're out there by yourself. It was late October, the kind of cold evening where the air feels sharp against your skin and the wind seems to whisper through the trees. I was 25 at the time, and I'd been out for a while, walking down the same familiar paths that I'd walked for years. This particular night, though, there was something off about the air. Maybe it was just the season change, or maybe it was the fact that I had stayed out there longer than I intended. But the woods felt different, maybe even a little darker. I had been out hiking for most of the afternoon, and I knew I needed to head back home. The sun was setting quickly, dipping below the horizon and casting everything into a faint, fading orange glow. I didn't want to be out there in the dark, especially since the trail back to my house wasn't exactly easy to follow in broad daylight, let alone when the night swallowed everything whole. I remember I'd brought a lantern with me just in case, something my dad always told me to do when I was younger. I wasn't stupid enough to think I could make it back without the light. I'd already had one nasty spill a couple of years ago when I tried to take that shortcut through the thicket near the stream. I still had the scar on my leg to remind me of that mistake. The forest, as beautiful as it was, could be unforgiving, and I wasn't about to let myself be careless. The woods weren't far from my house, a 10-minute walk from the backyard if you took the long way around, which was the path I usually preferred. The wind rustled through the trees as I walked, the familiar crunch of fallen leaves underfoot accompanying me as I moved through the narrow trail. I could hear the faint rustling of creatures hiding in the underbrush, maybe a deer or a rabbit. Everything felt normal, but the further I got, the more uneasy I began to feel. At first, I chalked it up to just being tired. I hadn't meant to walk this far. It wasn't like I'd been lost. I knew exactly where I was, but there was something in the air, something that had changed as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon. It was then that I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, something at the edge of the lantern's dim light. I thought it might be a trick of the light, a tree branch swaying in the wind, or a rock casting a long shadow. But as I stepped closer, the shape didn't move. It didn't shift or sway in the wind. It just stood there perfectly still. It was hard to make out any details at first. The figure seemed to be positioned across the trail, just on the edge of the small clearing where the trees opened up a bit. I wasn't sure if I was seeing things, but I could swear it was staring right at me. The figure was tall, taller than any man I'd ever seen, with a thin build, almost unnaturally so. They didn't move at all, not an inch. My heart began to race, and I suddenly felt the cold seeping deeper into my bones. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't acknowledge me in any way, simply stood there, facing my direction. The lantern flickered, casting erratic shadows on the trees around us. I tried to tell myself it was just someone out for a walk, but that didn't make sense. Who would be out here at this hour, in this deep part of the woods? I lifted the lantern higher, shining the light directly towards the figure. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the area. But the figure didn't flinch, didn't move. It was as though it didn't even notice the light, like it was caught in some trance, frozen in place. I could feel my pulse thudding in my ears. I stared for a few moments longer, waiting to see if the person would move. But they didn't. My thoughts raced. Should I walk up to them? Should I call out? But even as I considered those options, I knew that if I did, it might provoke something I didn't want to see. Something that could make this situation much worse. A creeping dread began to settle in. The longer I stood there, the more I felt like I was being watched by something or someone that didn't belong. The woods were quiet now, eerily so, the usual sounds of the night animals gone. It was as if the world had gone still, holding its breath. I felt a rush of panic build up in my chest. I knew I needed to get moving. I wasn't sure why, but something told me that standing here waiting wasn't a good idea. Slowly, I began to back away, not taking my eyes off the figure. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like if I turned my back, it might rush at me. I wasn't sure what to expect, but every instinct in my body screamed at me to keep my distance. I took a few more steps backward, never breaking eye contact with the figure. My hands were clammy, and I gripped the lantern tighter, the light shaking in my hands. As I moved farther down the trail, I turned the lantern around, casting its glow behind me to make sure the figure didn't follow. But even though I could no longer see it, the feeling of being watched lingered. My heart raced. I didn't want to run, not in the dark and not in the woods where I could easily fall, but I couldn't stand the thought of staying out there any longer. Something wasn't right. The air felt heavier now, the wind cold against my neck. I picked up my pace, walking faster, then eventually breaking into a light jog. I could hear the sound of my feet hitting the dirt, the leaves crunching underneath, and the rapid beat of my heart in my chest. I wasn't sure what I was running from, but the thought of staying out there was unbearable. The longer I was in the woods, the more I realized just how isolated I was. It was a familiar trail, but something felt off about it now. I couldn't shake the image of that figure, standing in the darkness. Even though I couldn't see them anymore, I felt like they were still out there, somewhere just behind me, watching. I pushed myself harder, my legs aching, my lungs burning, but I didn't care. I needed to get home, to the safety of my house where I knew the world outside the walls of my home didn't feel so oppressive. The path seemed longer now. It twisted and turned, the trees closing in around me, and the night was deeper. My lantern's light barely cut through the thick, dark air, and the once familiar trail now seemed foreign, sinister. It wasn't long before I started hearing things again. Faint rustling in the trees, something moving just beyond my sight. Couldn't stop, couldn't slow down. The feeling of someone or something pursuing me was too strong. The woods felt alive with hidden dangers. I didn't know if it was just my mind playing tricks, but I wasn't about to wait around to find out. I pushed forward, ignoring the growing exhaustion in my legs, the tightness in my chest. Finally, I reached the edge of the woods. My house came into view through the trees, the comforting outline of the old farmhouse standing there like a beacon. I didn't stop to catch my breath. I didn't even slow down as I sprinted across the open field, my heart pounding in my ears. When I reached the front door, I slammed it shut behind me, locking the deadbolt with shaky hands. I didn't feel safe, though. Not really. I was inside, yes, but the woods, those woods, still felt too close. I stood there for a moment, just breathing, my skin clammy, the adrenaline slowly fading away. That night, I didn't sleep much. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside, made me jump. I kept thinking about that figure, and though I tried to tell myself it was just a person out for a walk, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something else, something wrong. The next day, I returned to the woods, determined to find some logical explanation. But when I went back to the spot where I had seen the figure, there was nothing. No sign of anyone having been there at all. The ground was undisturbed, the trees standing still as ever. I looked around, but all I found was the familiar silence of the woods. I don't know what happened that night. Maybe it was just my imagination running wild, or maybe there really was someone out there. But whatever it was, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly avoided something far worse, something that I wouldn't want to meet again in those woods. After that night, I stuck to the well-trodden paths, and I never went out past sunset again. The woods still felt like a part of me, but I learned that sometimes, even the most familiar places can hold something you'd rather not encounter. It was September of 2019 when I took a solo hiking trip up in the Thunder Bay region of Ontario. I was 32 at the time and needed a break from the busy routine of life. My job had been grinding me down for months, and even though I'd always been a bit of a nervous type when it came to being alone in the wilderness, I had a strong craving to get away from the noise of everyday life. I figured a few days on my own, hiking the trails around Sleeping Giant Provincial Park, would do me some good. The name itself had always drawn me in. It sounded peaceful, but something about it also had a strange weight to it. The first day went well. I parked my car at the trailhead early in the morning and hiked steadily most of the day. The terrain was rugged but manageable. Tall pine trees stretched high above the narrow trail, and the air was cool and clean. I passed a few groups early on, but by the time I reached the first campsite near the shoreline, I hadn't seen another soul in hours. I liked that. Being alone out there felt right, even if it did keep me on edge a little. The site I picked was simple, a flat spot of ground tucked just at the tree line, with a good view of a small slope that led down to a narrow pebble beach along the lake. From where I was, I could see out across the open water, and the rhythm of the small waves lapping against the shore had a calming effect. It was early evening when I finished setting up my small one-person tent. I boiled some water and made a quick dehydrated meal. I ate while watching the sky slowly shift into a deep blue as the sun dropped lower and lower, the light fading behind the trees. As it got darker, the usual chill of the woods crept in. I bundled up and tried to settle in for the night, but I was already feeling that tension in my chest I always got the first night out. My heart would beat just a bit faster, and every little sound around me seemed sharper, louder. The way the forest came alive at night was something I'd never fully gotten used to. I knew all the rational things. Small animals moving through the brush, wind pushing the limbs around, birds and bugs. But none of that stopped my brain from imagining a stranger creeping through the woods. Some maniac with a knife, just waiting for the right tent. I tried to focus on my breathing and told myself it was just my imagination. Still, sleep didn't come easily. The inside of my tent was dimly lit by the soft red glow of my watch. I kept my sleeping bag zipped up tight and my flashlight within arm's reach. I shifted from side to side, listening. There were plenty of normal sounds. Crickets chirping, leaves rustling, occasional twigs snapping, but nothing too out of the ordinary. It was just loud, louder than it ever is back in town, and that made it harder to ignore. Then, sometime after midnight, I heard something different. It wasn't just the wind or a squirrel darting through the leaves. These were footsteps, not fast, not light, heavy, spaced out, like something large was walking just outside the tree line. I stopped breathing for a moment. The sound of my own heartbeat filled my ears. I couldn't move. I just lay there completely still, trying to convince myself it was nothing, just a deer maybe. But it didn't sound like a deer. It sounded bigger. The footsteps moved closer. I could hear branches breaking under the weight of whatever it was. Then it stopped. Just stopped. I couldn't hear anything but the small waves and my pulse thudding in my ears. I stayed like that, frozen for what felt like forever. My mind was racing through every worst-case scenario. Maybe it was a bear, or maybe someone else had come through the woods. Maybe someone knew I was out here alone. I could feel the cold sweat gathering at the back of my neck. Then it happened. A crash, like something heavy hitting the ground and sliding down. Stones tumbling, dirt shifting. It was right outside. I sat up in a panic and grabbed my flashlight, my hands trembling so much it took me 3 tries to switch it on. I took a deep breath, moved slowly toward the zipper, and pulled it down just a few inches. I peeked through the gap, and what I saw made me blink hard. There, at the bottom of the slope on the edge of the beach, was a large elk. Its legs were sprawled out at strange angles, and it looked dazed. The poor thing must have lost its footing up above and tumbled down the slope. Its antlers were tangled in a bush, and it was trying to shake free. I watched as it struggled for a few more seconds before finally pulling itself up, wobbling to its feet, and slowly trotting down the beach and out of sight. I let out a long, shaky breath and sat there in stunned silence. It had just been an elk. A clumsy, unlucky elk. All that fear, the pounding heart, the worst thoughts my mind could conjure. It had all been because of an animal slipping down a hill. I felt stupid and relieved all at once. I zipped the tent back up and lay down again, still shaking a little. But the fear was fading. I kept the flashlight on for a while longer, just in case, but eventually, my body gave in to exhaustion, and I finally slept. The next morning, I stepped out of the tent and looked down the slope. Sure enough, there were broken branches, scattered rocks, and a fresh trail where the elk had slid down. The beach was quiet, the water calm, the forest around me still and peaceful. I boiled water for coffee and sat on a flat rock near the slope, watching the sunlight stretch across the lake. It was a humbling reminder of how quickly fear can take hold, and how loud the woods can feel when you're all alone. But it also reminded me why I go on these trips. To shake myself out of routine, to test my edges, to face the parts of myself that still jump at shadows. I stayed out there for 4 more nights, each one a little easier than the last. No more elk crashes, no more heart-in-throat moments. Just the forest, the trail, and the quiet kind of strength that comes from being alone and okay. And that first night, scary as it was, became the story I'd end up telling the most. It was the summer of 2018 when my wife Claire and I went on our honeymoon. We had gotten married just a week earlier in the English countryside. After months of stressful planning and endless organizing, we were more than ready for a quiet escape. Instead of doing the usual European destinations, we wanted something different, something raw. So, we booked a 2-week trip to Koh Chang, an island off the eastern coast of Thailand. We'd read about its rugged jungle trails, quiet beaches, and lack of big resort crowds. It seemed like the perfect place to wind down and soak in some peace. About 5 days into our trip, we decided to hike one of the island's less popular jungle trails. Most tourists stuck to the waterfalls and beaches, but this trail looped through the forest interior and was said to be thick with wildlife and less traveled. It wasn't an official path by any means, just a route Claire found online in a local blog that promised quiet seclusion and real immersion into the jungle. We started early, around 7:30 in the morning, carrying 2 large bottles of water, a map we'd printed, snacks, and a small first aid kit. Claire also brought a whistle and a flashlight just in case. The first hour or so was magical. The sun pushed thin rays through the treetops and the heat wasn't yet oppressive. The smells were intense, earthy, damp, rich. Birds we didn't recognize called out from the canopy, and every so often we'd hear monkeys crashing through the trees in the distance. The trail was uneven and sometimes hard to follow, but it felt like we were part of something alive. Claire was ahead, snapping photos of strange vines and massive jungle ants. I followed closely, constantly checking the trail markings that someone had painted faintly on trees in red and orange. After about 2 hours in, we hadn't seen another person. It was incredibly quiet except for the occasional sound of birds or rustling. That's when we heard it. It was sudden, raw, and cut through the air like nothing I'd heard before. A scream, long and panicked, full of sheer desperation. It echoed through the trees, bouncing around us like the jungle itself was reacting. Claire stopped immediately. I could see it hit her like a brick, her whole body freezing. Then came another scream, this time even more frenzied. It wasn't an animal. It was unmistakably human. I felt something knot tightly in my stomach. Instinct kicked in. My first thought was that someone had fallen and was badly injured. Maybe a twisted ankle or worse, a broken leg, heat stroke, dehydration. We both started moving toward the sound without saying a word. The terrain became steeper, wetter, and harder to navigate. We slid down loose soil, pushed aside thick branches, and ducked under hanging vines. The screams came every minute or so, each one sounding more distant and hoarse. It felt like chasing something that was moving without direction. About 20 minutes into the scramble, the screams stopped. At first, I thought maybe we were going the wrong way, or the person had lost consciousness. Then, after a long pause, we heard crying, loud, uncontrolled sobbing. That was worse than the screaming. We moved faster. My shirt stuck to my back, soaked in sweat. My arms were scratched from the underbrush. Claire's hands trembled, but she didn't stop. The crying led us down a small slope and then through a muddy clearing where the light broke through the canopy. That's when we saw him. A man sat hunched over in the mud. His shirt was torn, his arms covered in red welts from insect bites and scratches. He looked disoriented, pale, and exhausted. His eyes were bloodshot and wide with terror. He kept glancing around like he expected something to jump from the bushes. I was relieved he was alive, but immediately worried about his mental state. He was in full-blown hysteria. He rocked back and forth, muttering things I couldn't understand. He clutched a ripped backpack and a smashed phone. Claire slowly crouched a few feet from him, her body language calm and gentle, and offered him water. I handed over one of our bottles and a granola bar. He snatched them like he hadn't eaten in days. Once he had some water in him, he started to calm down. Took a while, but slowly he was able to stand. He kept pointing in random directions, trying to tell us something. We pieced together that he had gone off trail while hiking alone the previous morning, got turned around, and ended up deep in the jungle with no working GPS, no phone signal, and no real idea where he was going. He'd spent the night out there in total darkness, surrounded by the noise of the jungle, completely lost. No fire, no food, barely any water. We were still about 2 hours from the nearest road, but I knew the general direction back. We adjusted our pace for him and kept him between us as we climbed back up the path we had come from. He stumbled often, so we took turns supporting him. He kept saying the same word in a heavy British accent, repeating it like a mantra. At some point, it clicked. His name was Rob, and back home in East Sussex, he lived barely a mile from our flat. Even stranger, he worked as an editor at the same publishing firm as my best friend Jack. That realization hit me hard. The odds felt impossible. We had traveled halfway across the world, picked an obscure trail in a remote part of Thailand, and found a man from our own neighborhood screaming for his life in the jungle. The hike back was grueling. The midday heat was relentless. Sweat dripped off our faces like rain. The jungle buzzed with insects, and our arms stung from bites. Claire poured water on a cloth and wiped Rob's neck to keep him cool. We rationed the last of our snacks between us, making sure he got the lion's share. At one point, I thought Rob might pass out. His pace slowed to a crawl. We took breaks every 10 minutes. I kept checking the trail markings, silently praying we wouldn't get turned around ourselves. The air felt thick like soup. My legs burned from the climb, but we kept pushing. Eventually, after what felt like hours, the trail opened up near a dirt road. I'd never been so happy to see a pickup truck rumbling by. We waved it down, and the driver, a local man delivering propane, took us all the way back to the southern beach town where we were staying. Back at our hotel, we called the local emergency clinic. They came to check Rob out and took him in for fluids and rest. He wasn't physically hurt beyond the scratches and dehydration, but he was mentally shaken. He looked like someone who had stared death in the face. Later that evening, after a shower and food, I sat on the balcony of our room and tried to make sense of everything. The jungle was still out there, humming under the stars. What stuck with me the most was the sound of Rob's scream. That raw desperation. It was the sound of someone who had lost hope. We visited him the next morning at the clinic. He was sitting up, color back in his face. He didn't recognize us from the neighborhood, and I didn't bring it up. He was still piecing things together, and I didn't want to overwhelm him. We flew back home 5 days later. I ran into Jack a couple of weeks after that and mentioned the incident without naming names. When I described what happened, he went quiet, then told me Rob had gone off the grid for a while after a personal breakdown. No one knew he had even gone to Thailand. The whole thing stayed with me for a long time. It made the world feel both massive and incredibly small. We came to the island looking for peace, for an escape. Instead, we found someone clinging to survival. I never went back to that trail. Claire and I still talk about it sometimes, usually in hushed tones, like we're trying not to wake something up. We went looking for the quiet parts of the world, and instead we found just how loud fear can be. That was the day the jungle screamed back. It was late, later than I had intended to be out there, but when you're solo camping, time seems to lose all meaning. I'd set up camp near the Chattooga River a few hours before, just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. The air had been cool, but not too cold, just crisp enough to feel fresh against my skin. There's something about being alone in nature that draws you in, something calming yet simultaneously intimidating, like the forest itself is watching you, waiting. It's the kind of feeling you can't explain, but you know it the moment you feel it. I was 28 at the time, and though I had spent my fair share of weekends outdoors, this was my first real solo camping trip. I'd done a couple of short hikes and a few nights in a cabin with friends, but never alone. The idea of solitude out there in the wilderness had always fascinated me. Now, here I was. Tent packed away for the night, hammock strung between two sturdy pines just far enough from the river to avoid flooding, but close enough to listen to the gentle rush of the water. The light had faded, and the only thing left was the sound of crickets, rustling leaves, and the occasional splash from the river. I lay back in my hammock, wrapped in my sleeping bag, and looked up at the stars. The night sky here was different, more vivid than what I was used to back home. The lack of city lights made it feel like the universe was stretching endlessly above me. But as I drifted off to sleep, something stirred in the silence. First, it was so faint I thought it was just the wind. A slight rustle, maybe a brush of something against the trees. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just another part of nature. But then, a few minutes later, there it was again, closer this time. A crunching sound in the leaves, a rustling, sharper this time. My heart rate quickened as the noise grew louder, closer. I was trying to stay calm, telling myself it was just some small creature, maybe a deer or a squirrel, but the sounds didn't stop. The leaves kept crunching, the branches kept rustling, until finally, it was unmistakable. Something was approaching my camp. I froze, straining to hear any additional sounds. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't want to move. I wasn't sure what to do. If it was an animal large enough to be a threat, I didn't want to attract its attention. I had heard the stories about hikers who were stalked by bears or wild cats, and now, in the quiet of the night, that fear felt all too real. But then came the worst part. My hammock began to shake. It wasn't a gentle sway like you get from the wind or a shifting branch. This was violent. The whole structure jerked beneath me. My heart raced as I flung my eyes open, panic setting in. My mind couldn't comprehend what was happening. For a split second, I thought I was dreaming, but then I saw it, a raccoon. Its little face was inches away from mine, its beady eyes gleaming in the moonlight. It had its paws on my hammock, shaking it back and forth, as though it were trying to get to something. My boots, my stupid boots, they were hanging right next to me, dangling off the edge of the hammock where I had foolishly left them within reach. Before I could even process what was going on, the raccoon took a swipe at them. His claws caught one boot, and it yanked it off the ground. I yelped, scrambling to sit up. My heart thudded in my chest as I tried to shove myself out of the hammock. In my panic, my limbs felt clumsy. My head swam with adrenaline. The raccoon froze for a split second as I moved, but then it darted off into the night, taking my boot with it. I lay there for a moment, wide-eyed, heart hammering in my chest. Couldn't believe it. I had just been attacked by a goddamn raccoon. A small, furry bandit who had no problem with the idea of making off with my footwear. I let out a shaky laugh, my hands still trembling. This was my first time camping alone, and already I was getting a taste of what it meant to truly be vulnerable out here in the wilderness. But that wasn't the end of it. I managed to calm myself down enough to retrieve my boot. I hadn't seen the raccoon again, but I figured it might still be lurking nearby, watching. So I pulled the boot back up into the hammock with me, tucking it underneath the straps of my sleeping bag to keep it out of reach. I decided it was best to stay alert for a while, though. If there was one raccoon out there, there could be more. And sure enough, there were. Over the next few hours, I must have heard at least 3 or 4 different raccoons rummaging around my camp. At first, I tried to ignore them, hoping they'd just go away. But the longer I stayed there, the bolder they got. They began to get more creative, circling my hammock and pawing at everything they could reach. I lay there in the dark, eyes wide open, listening to the scurrying noises, the little paws tapping on the ground. It was almost like they were taunting me, daring me to make a move. Every time I heard one approach, I would hold my breath, hoping it would pass me by. But they always seemed to find something else to mess with. My spare jacket, my food bag, my backpack. Nothing was safe. There was a particularly bold one that kept poking around the corner of my hammock. It would scurry away whenever I shifted, but it always came back. After a while, I couldn't tell if I was imagining it, but I swore I could hear them laughing. Just this little series of snickers and rustles, as if they were having fun at my expense. Couldn't sleep. I had never realized how much a single raccoon could unsettle you until I spent an entire night with one. It was more than just the noise. It was the fact that they were so small, so clever, and they could get into anything. I had to keep reminding myself that they weren't dangerous, but it was hard not to feel like I was being overrun by these little gremlins of the forest. At one point, I even heard what sounded like one of them chewing through my food bag. The thought of those little bandits making off with my snacks made me want to scream. But I knew I had to keep my cool. If I let fear take over, I was done for. So I waited, gritting my teeth, determined to outlast them. But the night wore on. The raccoons didn't give up. In fact, they seemed to grow more persistent, like they were getting a kick out of my frustration. I could hear them rustling closer, feel the ground vibrating slightly as they shuffled around my campsite. By the time the sky started to lighten with the first hints of dawn, I was physically and mentally exhausted. I hadn't slept at all. I was just too jumpy, too worried that they'd come back for my boots or start tearing into my pack. And then, just as the sun began to peek over the horizon, I heard one last sound. A soft thud followed by the unmistakable sound of paws padding away. I barely moved, but I could tell that whatever had been lurking around the camp was gone. The night was finally over. The raccoons had left me alone. As the sun began to rise fully, casting long shadows over the trees, I let out a long breath, finally able to relax. I didn't know if it was the end of the world, but it sure felt like it for a while. I lay there for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest waking up, birds chirping, the river rushing by, the wind moving through the leaves. It felt like I had survived something. I wasn't sure if I would ever go camping alone again, but if I did, I was definitely going to make sure I hung my food higher than I had the night before, and I was going to make damn sure I never, ever left my boots within reach of those little thieves. It was early January, the middle of summer in Australia, when I set out with two mates for a week-long hike through the eastern ranges near the border of New South Wales and Queensland. We were in our mid-20s, all reasonably fit, and had done a few shorter hikes before, but this was our first proper multi-day trek. We picked the main range section of the Great Dividing Range, drawn in by photos of jagged peaks, open alpine plains, and untouched river valleys. We'd planned it to avoid crowds and take advantage of the dry season. The idea was to hike light, no heavy tents, just sleeping bags and lightweight tent flies in case of rain. The first few days were stunning. We passed through open high country where the grass shimmered gold in the sun. Sometimes the trail disappeared entirely, and we had to follow ridgelines and navigate by map and compass. At night, we'd find a flat patch of grass or soft earth and roll out our sleeping bags under the open sky. With no tents, we fell asleep watching the stars. One night, I even woke to see a shooting star stretch halfway across the sky. I remember how quiet it was. No traffic, no voices, just the rustling grass, the wind, and now and then a distant bird call. We carried most of our water, but we also filtered from streams where we could. The sun was harsh even in the higher elevations. By the end of each day, our skin would be tight and pink from the heat, and we'd collapse into our bags the moment the sun dipped. Nights got surprisingly cold. The open air, even in summer, would suck the heat right out of your body if you didn't layer up. It was on the fourth night that things got weird. We'd come down off a high ridge, having crossed a long saddle that afternoon, and found a small wooded clearing next to a thin stream. The trees were mostly snow gums and low scrub, and the ground was covered in dry leaf litter. At first glance, it looked like a good enough spot, protected from wind, flat and close to water. We ate early that evening, rehydrated pasta and some jerky, then washed our dishes, brushed our teeth, and tucked ourselves into our sleeping bags before full dark. That's when I noticed the caterpillars. I saw the first one as I was settling in, curled up on the corner of my sleeping bag. It was about 2 inches long, thick-bodied, and covered in fine brownish hairs. I flicked it off without much thought, but then I saw another, and another, and another. They were crawling slowly over the ground, up the sides of our packs, over our gear. When I turned on my headlamp and looked around, the forest floor seemed alive. They were everywhere, hundreds of them. I tried to sleep, thinking they'd avoid the warmth of my body, but every few minutes I'd feel a light tickle across my face, or the back of my hand, or down near my ankles. I kept the sleeping bag zipped all the way up with only a tiny opening for my face, but that didn't stop them. I'd be just drifting off, and suddenly a soft, bristly thing would brush my cheek or crawl over my forehead. They weren't dangerous, at least not that I knew, but it was hard to shake the feeling of being crawled on. And their hairs irritated the skin. Not sharp, but prickly, almost like fiberglass. After an hour or two, I gave up on sleep. I sat up and watched them moving in steady, aimless lines over the dirt and dead leaves. It reminded me of time-lapse footage I'd seen of ant colonies, a kind of slow-motion infestation. Every time I cleared one away, another took its place. I ended up pulling the tent fly over myself like a sheet, tucking it around my body. It helped for a while, but even then, a few managed to get under. I felt them crawl down into the sleeping bag from the opening near my face, or over the top of my socks. I couldn't figure out where they were coming from. The next morning, we all looked wrecked. None of us had slept properly. Our faces were blotchy and red from the irritation. Some bites or stings, or just rashy patches where the hairs had brushed bare skin. We packed up in silence, shaking our sleeping bags out thoroughly and checking every corner of our gear. I found 5 nestled in my boot. Another was stuck in the mesh of my backpack. We hiked out of that spot fast, trying to put distance between us and the infestation. That whole day, I felt like things were still crawling on me. Even though I'd stripped and changed clothes, I kept scratching and swatting at imaginary sensations. One of my mates found a live one in his shirt pocket an hour into the hike. None of us wanted to talk much about the night. It took another full day before we felt properly clean again. We spent the next night camped on a wide, grassy saddle with a light wind that seemed to keep the insects away. That night, I finally slept through without waking. When I got back home, I did some digging online. Turns out those fuzzy caterpillars were likely processionary caterpillars, known for moving in long lines and for causing skin irritation in some people. Their hairs can break off and lodge in skin or even get into the lungs if disturbed. Not deadly, but definitely something to avoid sleeping next to. Looking back, the hike was still one of the most beautiful I've done. The mountain views, the silent nights under the stars, the feeling of being far away from everything. It stuck with me. But so did that night in the caterpillar-infested woods. It wasn't the kind of terror you tell stories about at parties. It was quieter than that. Just a slow, creeping discomfort that stayed under your skin, literally and otherwise. Ever since then, I checked the ground a lot more carefully before bedding down for the night. I still hike without a tent sometimes, but I always carry the fly, and if the ground looks even slightly off, too many leaves, weird movement, anything, I keep moving. That was 8 years ago now. I haven't seen a caterpillar like that since, and I hope I never do. Some things stick with you in the oddest ways. You expect fear to come from cliffs or storms or wild animals, but sometimes it's just a quiet, crawling thing in the night that leaves the biggest mark. I've always loved hiking, but it wasn't until that summer that I found myself out on the trail, hoping to find something truly remote. My friend Kyle and I had been talking about this for a while, wanting to get away from civilization, really immerse ourselves in nature. We had planned this trip for almost a year, setting aside time to find the perfect spot to camp. We didn't want to just find any place, though. It had to be secluded, no crowds, no noise, no distractions. The kind of place where you could disappear for a while and not worry about anything except the sound of the wind and the crackling of a campfire. After several failed attempts and getting frustrated with other spots that were either too close to trails or overrun with other campers, we finally stumbled across it. It was perfect. I remember the first time we saw it on the map, a little speck on the edge of the forest, perched on a cliff above the river. It was about a half-hour walk from any trail or road, making it feel entirely isolated. The steep drop to the river below was just the kind of natural barrier that made this place feel like a fortress. We spent the next few days packing, gathering all the gear we would need. Neither of us had done anything like this before. No, we weren't wilderness survival experts, but we were determined to make it work. The plan was simple. Hike in, set up camp, enjoy the peace, and maybe do a little exploring. We had no idea what kind of trouble we were walking into. The first day of the hike was exhausting, but we made it to the spot just as dusk started to settle in. We were both drenched in sweat, tired, but happy. There was no one else for miles, just the chirping of insects and the faint sound of the river below. It was exactly what we were looking for. We got our tents up quickly. The air was cool and the sky was turning purple with the fading light. There was a sense of satisfaction in getting the camp ready, but also an underlying feeling of something more, something like anticipation. After all, we had been talking about this trip for so long, and now we were finally here. We had brought a small stove and some food to last the night, so we decided to heat up some canned chili and relax for a bit before heading out to explore. The light was dimming fast, and though we had our flashlights, we didn't want to venture too far in the dark. So we stuck to the area around the camp, walking the edge of the cliff, listening to the sound of the river and taking in the views of the wilderness surrounding us. That's when we saw it. At first, it was just a silhouette, something out of place against the trees, right on the edge of the cliff. We both froze, not sure what we were looking at. The sun had just dipped behind the horizon, and the shadows were long, but there was something unmistakable about the shape. A shack, maybe? It looked like it had been built in a rush, the kind of structure you wouldn't expect to find in such a remote place. We exchanged a glance, both of us equally curious and uneasy. "What the hell?" Kyle muttered, his voice barely audible. I was about to say the same thing when we both started walking toward it, drawn by the need to know what was there. There was no reason to think it was dangerous, not yet anyway, but something about the sight of that structure made my gut twist in a way I couldn't ignore. We followed the sound of the river, using it as a guide, as we approached the shack. The closer we got, the more it became clear. This wasn't just some abandoned hut or a hunter's cabin. No, it was more makeshift. It looked like a teepee made from scraps of aluminum, old tarps, and bits of sheet metal, rusted and bent out of shape. There was no real door, just a hole in the side. My flashlight beam danced over it, highlighting the strange structure in the night. My mind was racing as we stepped closer, and that's when I saw it, the air mattress. An inflated mattress was lying in the middle of the small shack, covered in stains and dust. On the ground around it were scattered bottles of wine and whiskey, some half empty, some tipped over. The smell of alcohol hit me immediately, sharp and sickly sweet. But it wasn't just the booze that caught my attention. As my flashlight moved, I saw piles of things, strange things. There were porn magazines, scattered haphazardly across the ground, their pages bent and torn. Odd, crude objects were strewn around, things that no sane person would leave out in the open, especially in a place so far from anywhere. A couple of rusted knives, a few broken electronics, and what looked like a mannequin head. I felt my stomach churn. "What the hell is all this?" Kyle whispered, his voice low but tinged with a growing unease. I didn't respond, couldn't. There was a cold, uncomfortable feeling settling over me now. Something didn't add up. Whoever had made this place had to have been here recently. The air mattress looked fresh, the items scattered around it not worn down by the elements, which made no sense. There were no signs of other people around, no vehicles, no footprints, nothing. And yet, the shack felt like it had been lived in, if only for a short time. It was too strange to ignore. Kyle and I both knew the same thing without saying it. This was a place that wasn't meant to be found, and whoever had made it didn't want to be found. I was about to turn and leave when I saw something that froze my blood. There, in the center of the small fire pit outside the shack, the fire was still smoldering. The embers glowed faintly, just enough to make the shadows flicker unnaturally. The chill of the night suddenly felt colder, more biting. That's weird," Kyle muttered under his breath. I nodded, my mind racing. The fire had only just been put out, and yet no one was here. We would have seen someone if they'd been around. Hell, we were walking through the woods just a few hundred yards away not long before. But now, nothing. I had seen enough. I didn't need to investigate further. The unsettling feeling was becoming overwhelming, and I knew that we were dangerously close to something we should never have found. My heart was pounding in my chest, and every instinct in me screamed to leave. We didn't talk. We didn't need to. I just turned, and Kyle followed suit. We didn't run, but we didn't waste any time either. Our backpacks were still set up at camp, but I couldn't bring myself to go back there just yet. I needed to move to get away from whatever the hell this was. We trekked back through the woods, the trees dark and looming over us, each step feeling heavier as we put more distance between us and that shack. The river was still murmuring in the background, guiding us, but the silence that had settled between us felt wrong. My mind was racing with possibilities, none of them good. Someone had been out here recently, someone who didn't want to be found. And now that we had found their camp, what if they knew we were here? What if they were watching us right now? I didn't dare look behind me. By the time we made it back to camp, I was already packing up my things. My hands were shaking, but I didn't care. I wasn't staying another minute in that spot, not with what we'd just discovered. We both moved quickly, shoving everything into our bags without bothering to organize it properly. When we were done, we didn't look back. We grabbed our gear and started walking, making our way back to the trailhead as fast as we could. We knew the way now. The night had fully settled in, but neither of us said a word. There was nothing more to say. By the time we reached the road, we were exhausted, but we didn't care. We had made it out. We were safe, but something gnawed at me, the fire, the way that shack had felt. I kept thinking about it, the strange sense of dread I couldn't shake. I knew we had been right to leave. I didn't know who had made that place or why they'd left it behind, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept hearing the sound of the river in my mind, the crackling of that fire, and the sense that we had barely escaped something we weren't meant to see. To this day, I can't explain it, but I know one thing for sure. There was something off about that place, and I will never go back. It was late summer, 2024, the heat lingering in the air long after the sun dipped below the hills. The ground was parched, and the once green grass had turned a brittle brown, crackling under my horse's hooves as we made our way down a dusty trail. The place was quiet, save for the occasional call of a hawk overhead and the soft swish of my horse's mane as it flicked the sweat off its neck. The woods surrounding the path were thick and dense, the trees tall and straight, casting long shadows that crept over the trail. The sun had just set, leaving a dim, golden hue in the sky as the temperature began to drop, and I felt a cool breeze brush against my face. I had been riding for a while, savoring the solitude of the forest. I often took these rides to clear my mind, to disconnect from the world that seemed to pull harder at me each day. Life on the farm was always busy, but in these moments, I was alone, only the soft clip-clop of my horse's hooves keeping me company. As I rode down the trail, I heard a faint noise, a soft tink-tink sound. It was almost like the sound of glass tapping against something solid. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again. Curious, I leaned forward in the saddle and scanned the ground ahead, trying to see where the sound was coming from. My eyes caught a glint of something shiny near the base of a tree. The trail was narrow, barely wide enough for the horse to pass through comfortably, and I had to steer him a little to the side to get a better view. It was then that I saw it. Sitting on the ground next to a small bush was a glass bottle. But there was something odd about it. The bottle was tipped on its side, and I could see something small moving inside. I dismounted, tethering my horse to a nearby branch. The quiet of the forest was almost eerie, broken only by the rustling of leaves in the breeze and the distant calls of birds settling down for the night. I walked over to the bottle, crouching down beside it to take a closer look. Inside, there was a mouse. It was small, its fur a pale brown, and it was frantic, scurrying around in the confines of the bottle, trying desperately to escape. I couldn't understand how it had gotten there. The bottle was narrow, the opening just wide enough for the mouse to squeeze in, but not large enough for it to get back out. The poor thing was trapped, its tiny paws pressing against the glass as it looked up at me, its dark eyes wide with fear. I felt a pang of sympathy. I carefully picked up the bottle, turning it upright. The mouse froze, looking at me for a moment before it seemed to realize I wasn't a threat. Gently, I tipped the bottle, setting it down on the ground, and the mouse scurried out, darting away into the underbrush. It didn't go far, just far enough to feel safe. I watched it for a moment, wondering how it had gotten in the bottle in the first place. But then I turned my attention back to the trail. My horse was waiting for me, and I didn't want to linger too long. I remounted and continued down the path, the sound of my horse's hooves once again filling the air. The sun had dipped even further, and the forest was beginning to feel darker, the shadows stretching longer. The temperature had dropped, and I pulled my jacket a little tighter around my shoulders, shivering slightly. It had been a long day, and I still had quite a ways to go before I'd reach the old barn I was heading to. I wasn't in any particular rush. The journey was peaceful, the quiet of the woods soothing. But then I heard it, a faint whine, barely audible over the sound of the wind, drifted through the trees. At first, I thought I had imagined it, but then it came again, a soft, pitiful sound, like a dog in distress. I stopped my horse, turning its head toward the direction of the noise. There it was again, a whimper, followed by a low, quiet bark. It was coming from somewhere up ahead. I nudged my horse forward, my curiosity piqued. As I rode, the sound grew clearer, the dog's whine becoming more distinct. It was soft but desperate, as though the animal was in pain. The barking wasn't loud, but it was persistent, like the dog was trying to communicate with someone, anyone who might be near. I guided my horse through the trees, the sound of the dog growing louder with each step. Soon, I reached a narrow creek that ran alongside the trail, its waters bubbling gently over smooth rocks. The dog's whine was much louder now, and I could see a flash of movement near the water's edge. I urged my horse forward, dismounting when I saw the dog clearly. It was a German Shorthair, its coat once sleek and shiny, now matted and thin. Its body trembled, and it was lying at the edge of the creek, struggling weakly against something. I walked closer, my heart sinking when I saw what was wrong. The dog had its collar caught on a thick root that protruded from the bank. The collar had snagged on the root, and the dog had been unable to free itself. It was stuck, its body weak from days of struggle, its fur filthy and stained. The poor thing looked like it hadn't had a decent meal in weeks, its ribs showing clearly through its skin. I approached cautiously, not wanting to scare the dog further. Its eyes were wide with fear, but there was a flicker of recognition in them. It had seen me, and I could tell that, despite its condition, it was still aware enough to trust me. The dog's tail wagged weakly, just a small flick of movement, but it was enough to show that it still had some fight left in it. I kneeled down beside the dog, my fingers trembling slightly as I reached for the collar. The root was thick, and it had wrapped itself around the collar tightly. The dog's breathing was shallow, each breath a struggle. I worked quickly, trying to loosen the collar, but the more I pulled, the tighter it seemed to get. I could hear the dog whine softly, its legs twitching as it tried to move, but it was too weak to do much more than squirm. Then, I heard the soft rustle of something in the bushes. I turned just in time to see a flash of movement, and I froze. My heart skipped a beat. Someone was coming. I stood up quickly, my mind racing. Who else was out here? It was late, and I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail all day. The figure that emerged from the trees was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in dark clothes, his face obscured by the shadows. He didn't speak, just looked at me with a cold stare, his eyes narrowing when they settled on the dog. "Found him, huh?" the man said, his voice rough and gravelly. It wasn't a question. I stepped back, my instincts telling me to be cautious. There was something unsettling about him, something that made my skin crawl. I didn't want to engage, but I couldn't just leave the dog there, not in its state. "He's been stuck here for days," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm helping him." The man didn't respond right away. He just stood there, his eyes scanning the dog. Then, finally, he moved forward, kneeling beside me. His hands were calloused and rough, and he reached for the collar, pulling at it with more force than I would have liked. I winced, but the collar finally came loose. The dog let out a soft, relieved whine as it was freed, but it didn't move. It lay there, exhausted and trembling, its body too weak to do much else. The man stood up, wiping his hands on his pants. "You did good," he said, his voice less cold now, but still rough. "I've been looking for him for weeks." I blinked in surprise, looking up at him. "Weeks?" I asked, though I hadn't meant to speak. "How long has he been missing?" 3 weeks, he said quietly, looking down at the dog. "He's a good dog, a hunting dog. We were out here training. I don't know what happened. He must have got caught and couldn't get out. I've been searching everywhere." He paused, looking around the creek before turning his gaze back to the dog. "I'm glad you found him," he added, his voice softer now. I nodded, my heart aching for the dog. It had been through so much, and yet, there was still a glimmer of life in its eyes. It wasn't too late. "I'll call the vet," I said, pulling my phone from my pocket. "He needs help. I'll stay with him until we can get him to a proper place." The man didn't argue. He watched as I dialed the number, and when I spoke to the vet, I could hear the relief in his voice when he realized the dog would survive. The rest of the night was a blur of activity. Getting the dog back to the vet, seeing him treated, and making sure he was well taken care of. The man stayed with me, quietly watching over his dog as the vet worked, and by the time the sun was rising the next day, the dog was stable, its chances of survival high. It wasn't the adventure I had expected when I set out on my ride that evening, but it was one that had changed me. It reminded me that sometimes, in the most unexpected moments, we find ourselves called to act, to help, to make a difference in the lives of others, human or animal alike. And it reminded me of the power of persistence and hope, even when things seemed bleak. By the time I left, the man thanked me. His dog was recovering, and I could see the bond between them, stronger than ever, forged through the trials they had faced together. I had been hiking in the backcountry for several days, enjoying the solitude and beauty of British Columbia's northern islands. The weather had been perfect, the skies clear, and the air cool with a light breeze. My destination was a remote beach near a small inlet just north of Port Hardy, a place I had read about in a guidebook. It was a spot known only to a few, untouched, unspoiled, and off the beaten path. After a few days of long, exhausting hikes through thick forests and over rugged terrain, I finally made it to the beach. I had chosen the spot carefully, a small clearing just a few feet from the water's edge. The waves gently lapped against the shore, and I could hear the faint sound of the wind rustling through the tall trees behind me. It was the kind of place that felt secluded, safe from the world and far away from the chaos of everyday life. The sun was low in the sky when I set up my camp, unpacked my gear, and went about the usual routine of cooking my dinner. The campfire crackled, sending small sparks into the air as I roasted a fish I had caught earlier that day. The smell of cooking fish mixed with the salty air and the earthy scent of the forest behind me. It was peaceful, tranquil, and for a while I felt like the only person in the world. I ate slowly, savoring each bite of the fish, letting the warmth of the fire keep me comfortable against the cool evening air. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I cleaned up, packed away the remnants of my meal, and retreated into the tent for the night. It had been a long day of hiking, and I was exhausted. The moment my head hit the pillow, I fell into a deep sleep, the kind that only comes after a day spent outdoors, pushing your body to its limits. The rhythmic sound of the waves against the shore was soothing, and I drifted off without a second thought. But then, in the stillness of the night, I was abruptly awoken. At first, I couldn't tell if I was dreaming or if something was happening outside my tent. The sound was faint but unmistakable. A heavy, labored breathing, like something was standing just outside, right by the beach, close to where my fire had been. My heart skipped a beat as I lay still in the darkness, listening carefully. The breathing was deep and slow, almost like a large animal trying to catch its breath. The sound sent a chill down my spine, and every instinct in my body told me to stay silent, to stay still and wait. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what was happening. The first thing that came to my mind was a bear. The area I was in was remote, and while bears were uncommon on this part of the island, they weren't entirely unheard of. But the more I thought about it, the less likely it seemed. I had read that bear sightings here were rare, especially so close to the coast where human activity was minimal. Besides, the breathing was so heavy, almost exaggerated in its sound, that I doubted it could be a bear. And then, like an intrusive thought, something else crept into my mind. The urban legends, the tales of Bigfoot. I'd never really given them much thought before, dismissing them as fanciful stories told around campfires. But now, in the pitch black of the night, in the solitude of the forest, my mind started to entertain the possibility, however irrational. Bigfoot. The thought made me shiver, and I had to force myself to calm down. There was no such thing as Bigfoot, I reminded myself. I was just tired, my mind playing tricks on me. But the breathing continued, steady and rhythmic, like it was waiting for something, watching me. I had to know what it was. I slowly reached for my flashlight, my hands trembling slightly. The flashlight's beam cut through the darkness as I unzipped the tent flap, shining the light outside. For a moment, there was nothing, just the sound of the waves and the quiet of the night. My breath hitched as I scanned the beach, but I saw nothing. The fire pit, now covered by the incoming tide, was empty. There were no signs of any movement, no animals lurking in the shadows. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe the noise was just the wind, or perhaps I had heard the waves crashing and mistaken them for something else. But then I heard it again. A deep, heavy breath, followed by the unmistakable sound of something large splashing into the water. My heart pounded in my chest, and I instinctively stepped out of the tent, shining the flashlight in the direction of the noise. At first, I couldn't see anything. The flashlight beam flickered slightly, and I squinted into the darkness, my mind still racing. The sound of the waves was louder now, more pronounced, but still, there was something else. A deep, guttural sound, a splash, like something large was moving in the water. And then I saw it, a massive shape, slowly rolling around on the kelp beds near the shore. My flashlight picked up the silhouette of a large creature, its black body gleaming in the dim light. It was an orca, an enormous orca, rolling and playing on the kelp just a few yards from where I stood. The breath I had heard earlier was its exhale, the powerful blowhole of the whale releasing a deep, audible breath as it surfaced for air. I froze, unable to believe what I was seeing. This enormous marine mammal was the source of the noise that had scared me so badly. The sight of it, so close to shore, so massive, was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. I had never seen an orca this close, let alone in the wild, and I stood there in stunned silence as it continued to roll around on the kelp. Its dorsal fin broke the surface of the water, cutting through the air as it splashed around. I wasn't sure how long I stood there, mesmerized by the sight of this magnificent creature. But as I watched, I began to notice more shapes just beyond the first orca, smaller, more subtle movements in the water. There were other orcas, just beyond the first, drifting lazily in the waves. Some were just bobbing in the water, half asleep, while others moved closer to shore, rolling and playing in the kelp. It was like a family of orcas had decided to spend the night near my camp, and I was an unexpected spectator to their nightly routine. The entire experience was surreal. What had started as a terrifying encounter with an unknown creature turned into one of the most amazing things I had ever witnessed. The orcas were so graceful, so powerful, and yet they moved with a calmness that was almost hypnotic. I could see the muscles rippling beneath their sleek black skin as they moved through the water, their eyes occasionally glancing toward the shore as they swam past. The gentle splash of their movements was the only sound that broke the silence of the night. I had been afraid, but now, standing in the darkness, I felt a strange sense of peace. I was no longer scared. Instead, I was in awe of the sheer beauty and power of these animals. So close, so wild. I sat on the sand for hours, watching them, unable to look away. The night passed by slowly, the orca's presence a constant, mesmerizing reminder of how small I was in the grand scheme of things. As the hours wore on, the orcas began to drift farther out into the bay. Their movements became slower, more deliberate, as they began to disappear into the dark waters of the inlet. One by one, they left, until only the sound of the waves remained. When the last of the orcas had vanished into the distance, I realized how much time had passed. It was well past midnight, and the first light of dawn was beginning to peek over the horizon. I felt a deep sense of exhaustion from staying up all night, but I was also filled with a sense of wonder. What had started as a terrifying experience had turned into something beautiful and unforgettable. I never did sleep that night, not after the orcas left. I sat by the dying embers of my campfire, watching the water as the sky slowly lightened. The beach was quiet now, the only sound the soft lapping of the waves against the shore. I reflected on what had happened, still in disbelief over the encounter. It was one of those experiences that would stay with me forever, something so extraordinary that I knew I would never forget it. I had come to the island seeking solitude and peace, but what I found instead was a connection to something far larger than myself, something wild and free. The morning light broke across the water, and I knew it was time to pack up and move on. But I also knew that I would never forget that night, the night the orcas came to me on the shore. It was the summer of 2013 when my friend Sam and I decided to take a break from our university routine and head into the Australian outback. We were both studying environmental science, and the thought of exploring one of the world's harshest and most remote terrains was irresistible. The outback wasn't the kind of place you visited on a regular basis. It was unforgiving, immense, and untouched by the conveniences of modern life. There were no bustling cities, no tourist attractions, just vast stretches of arid land, punctuated by the occasional scrub and rocky outcrop. Sam and I were eager to see it firsthand. We were both in our early 20s, at that age where you think you can handle anything, a little overconfident, a little naive. We had just finished a semester of studying ecology and geology, and we figured this trip would be the perfect opportunity to apply some of the things we'd learned in the field. Armed with our backpacks, water, and a basic first aid kit, we set off into the wilds of Central Australia, miles away from any town. The first few days were idyllic. The weather was hot, but bearable. We navigated the terrain with a mix of excitement and apprehension. But as the days wore on, the novelty of it all started to wear off. The landscape, while stunning in its own right, was relentless. The red earth, the sparse vegetation, the overwhelming silence. It began to get to us. And then, on the fourth day of our hike, we found something that would change everything. We had spent the morning hiking up a steep, rocky hill, hoping to catch a glimpse of some wildlife. The air was dry, and the sun beat down relentlessly, making every step feel like an effort. When we reached the top, we stopped to rest, taking in the view of the desert stretching endlessly in all directions. It was beautiful in a way that felt almost too much to take in. But as we rested, something caught my eye. Just below the hill, nestled in a patch of scrubby bushes at the base of a sheer cliff, was an unusual sight: a plastic bag. Plastic isn't something you expect to find in the outback. The area we were in was hundreds of kilometers away from the nearest town, and the only people who would venture this far were scientists, explorers, or occasionally indigenous groups. The plastic bag seemed completely out of place, especially given how far we were from civilization. Without thinking too much about it, I nudged Sam and pointed it out. We were curious, but at the same time a little uneasy. Sam hesitated. "That's strange," he muttered, his gaze flicking back to the barren landscape around us. "Wonder what it's doing here." I stood up, brushing the dust from my pants. "Let's check it out." I don't know why we went over to it. Maybe it was the sheer oddity of it. Maybe it was because we hadn't seen another soul for days. The thought of discovering something or someone out there felt like a small victory. We approached the bush where the bag was, and I crouched down to get a better look. The plastic bag was tightly wrapped, its contents barely visible. It looked old, as if it had been there for some time. I pulled the bag closer, peeling back the edges carefully. What I saw inside made my stomach tighten. It wasn't trash. Inside the bag, there were several damaged wallets, their leather cracked and stained, some of the zippers broken, others with the edges frayed. The wallets were scattered about haphazardly, as if someone had dumped them there in a hurry. The strangest part was that they were all women's wallets. I could see a few credit cards peeking out from some of them, but what stood out the most were the identification cards, each one in a different name, but all with a similar age range. Late teens to early 20s. A few were from the Northern Territory, one from Sydney, and another from Queensland. For a moment, I felt a strange sense of discomfort. It didn't make sense. This wasn't some lost tourist group's belongings. The fact that all the wallets were so damaged, so scattered, suggested they had been left there for quite a while. My mind started running in all directions, imagining the worst-case scenarios. Could these people have met some tragic fate out here? Were they part of a group that had gone missing? Sam stood behind me, his expression unreadable. "What do you think?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't know what to think. It didn't feel right. We were so far from help, from any sign of civilization, that it seemed impossible for someone to have just dropped these wallets. I tried to push the uneasy feeling away, telling myself it was just some hikers who had lost track of their things. After a long silence, I made the decision. We would take the wallets with us. It felt wrong to just leave them there, especially if someone had been injured or stranded. If they were from hikers, we could hand them over to the authorities. If they weren't, maybe someone would still be able to figure out what had happened. With no phone signal and no GPS out here, it seemed like the only reasonable course of action. I wrapped the plastic bag carefully, making sure the wallets were secure. As we made our way back to camp, I felt a sense of unease settling in my chest. We were in the middle of nowhere, with no real understanding of how long those wallets had been out there. It was only when we returned to our tents, far from any other hikers, that I began to wonder if we'd made a mistake. But we had already made our decision, and there was no going back now. The next day, we packed up and began the long trek back to the nearest town. The whole time, I couldn't shake the thought of those wallets. I kept telling myself we had done the right thing. We were helping, right? The bags weren't just abandoned trash. They had to belong to someone. It was several days later when we finally reached the police station in Alice Springs. I still remember the officer who greeted us. He was older than I expected, graying hair, with the kind of tired expression that came from years of seeing things he'd rather forget. When we handed over the plastic bag, his demeanor shifted slightly. He didn't say much at first, just took the bags from us, examining them carefully. "You found these where?" he asked, finally breaking the silence. I explained what had happened, telling him about the location and how we'd come across the bags. He didn't seem to show much emotion, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something I couldn't quite place. "Right," he said, nodding slowly. "We'll take it from here." Sam and I left the station, both of us feeling strangely unsettled. We didn't know it then, but that encounter would come back to haunt us. A few weeks later, we saw the story in the news. The wallets, as it turned out, belonged to a group of young women who had gone missing several months before we found them. The police had been investigating their disappearance for weeks, but there had been no leads. The discovery of the wallets, however, led to a break in the case. The bodies of the women were eventually discovered, not far from the area where we had found the bags. The police never told us the full details of what had happened, but we both knew it was something darker than just an unfortunate accident. They had been victims of something far more sinister, and those wallets were the only clue left behind. The worst part? No one had ever figured out who was responsible. The authorities never found any suspects. The only certainty we had was that we had stumbled upon a crime scene in the middle of nowhere, and that our lives would never be the same. I had just turned 28, and the summer of 2015 was meant to be my escape. I needed time away from the grind of the city, time to unwind, to be alone with my thoughts. I'd packed my old, beat-up van with all my camping gear and headed off for what I thought would be a peaceful week in the backcountry. A road trip, no real plan, just going where the wind took me. My first stop was a national park in northern Wyoming, one of those places that boasted untamed wilderness and jaw-dropping views. It was supposed to be the perfect place to clear my head and feel like I was living again. I arrived late in the evening after the sun had set. The campgrounds were quiet, and I noticed a handful of campers already tucked into their tents, their campfires now reduced to small embers. I checked in at the ranger station and was assigned a secluded spot a bit further from the others. It was one of those campsites that felt almost too far removed from everything. I didn't mind though, more solitude, more quiet. I set up my tent, organized my gear, and cooked a quick meal. It wasn't long before the stars began to show in the sky. The night sky here as clear as it had been in years. There was no moon, just a scattering of stars. I lay in my tent, listening to the sounds of the woods around me. The wind whispered through the trees, and every now and then, I heard the distant call of a coyote or the rustle of something in the underbrush. I should have felt at ease, but there was something about the isolation that stirred unease in my gut, a feeling that I couldn't shake. I had just settled in, almost asleep, when a loud, echoing voice split through the silence, startled me awake. "Get in your car, now!" I jolted upright, heart hammering, barely able to make sense of the words. Outside my tent, a flashlight beam swept across the campsite, cutting through the darkness. It was the park ranger, his voice sharp, urgent. "Get in your car, now! It's not safe." I scrambled out of my sleeping bag, half asleep, confused. What was happening? Why was the ranger shouting at me? My first thought was to grab my phone, but it was dead. There was no time to think, no time to make sense of things. I unzipped the tent in a hurry and looked out. The ranger's flashlight flicked across my eyes, momentarily blinding me, but I saw his face, tense, focused. "Get in your car," he repeated, more forcefully this time, before the light flicked away, scanning the other campsites. I didn't hesitate. I had no idea what was going on, but the panic in the ranger's voice was enough to make me move. I grabbed my keys and ran to my van. As I fumbled with the door, I heard the ranger shout again, this time farther away, warning the other campers. I could hear hurried footsteps all around me, the sound of tents being packed up. Everyone was scrambling. I started the van, the engine rumbling to life, and within seconds, I pulled out onto the dirt road, the ranger's flashlight flashing behind me. I didn't know where I was going, but the only direction that felt safe was away from whatever was going on back there. The woods seemed eerily quiet now, almost too still, as though the forest itself had been caught off guard by the chaos. As I drove away from the campground, I couldn't help but feel a tightness in my chest. What had happened? The ranger didn't explain, but his fear had been tangible. Something was wrong, seriously wrong. Minutes later, I saw flashing lights behind me. Police lights. I didn't even have time to process what was happening before a car pulled up next to me, forcing me to pull over. The officer in the car didn't waste any time. He was already out and walking toward my van before I even put the gear shift in park. "Stay in the vehicle," he ordered sharply. I could see his hand resting on his weapon, but his eyes were wide, darting back and forth. There was no mistaking it. Something had gone horribly wrong. I rolled down the window, my heart racing. "What's going on? What's happening?" I asked, my voice shaky. "Get out of the van," he barked, ignoring my question. I opened my mouth to protest, but the officer was already yanking open the door. He didn't give me a chance to react before pulling me roughly out of the seat and dragging me to the ground. I hit the dirt hard, the wind knocked out of me. My head spun, disoriented from the sudden violence. "What the hell?" I gasped, but the officer didn't let up. He spun me onto my back and pinned me there with his knee on my chest. "You're coming with us," he said, his voice tight. "We think you're involved with something. You're in the middle of a crime scene. Do you understand?" His hand shot to his radio, and I heard muffled voices crackling through. I had no idea what he was talking about. My mind was still trying to process the ranger's warning, the chaos in the campground. I opened my mouth to speak, to explain that I was just a camper, just passing through, but the officer wasn't listening. He had me on the ground, his grip like iron. I couldn't move. "For people are dead," he muttered to himself as if he were speaking to the air. "The suspect is still on the loose." "What?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely audible. "What do you mean? I'm not involved in anything." But the officer didn't seem to hear me. He kept his knee pressed into my chest, and I could feel the strain in my ribs. After what felt like an eternity, more cars arrived, and other officers poured out, weapons drawn, eyes scanning the area. A few of them started looking through my van, opening the back doors and checking under the seats. "Where is he?" one officer barked. "Where's who?" I asked, still lying there, stunned. "The murderer. We know he's in the area," the officer said, voice low and dangerous. "Don't play games." "Look, I just came from the campground," I protested, still struggling to breathe. "I'm just passing through. I don't know anything about any murders. I'm just a guy in a van." They didn't seem to believe me. After what felt like hours of questioning and searching through my vehicle, they finally dragged me to my feet and shoved me into the back of a squad car. I couldn't understand what was going on. This all felt like a nightmare. They kept asking me questions about the campground, about anyone I might have seen, but it was clear that I had no answers. I hadn't seen anything. I hadn't heard anything. I could only assume that the park ranger's urgent shout had been about the grizzly bear attack. But why were the police so convinced that I was somehow involved with this murderer? It wasn't until much later that I finally learned the truth. The man they were looking for was a convicted felon, someone who had been on the run for years, hiding out in the park. He'd killed 4 people, and the police were certain he had escaped in the chaos following the bear attack. They thought I might be hiding him in my van, using the weapons they found in my vehicle to protect him. It was the machete I carried for protection, something I had never used, but they didn't know that. The moment I was released from police custody, I got back in my van and drove for hours, my mind reeling. The entire experience had left me shaken, more than I cared to admit. I didn't feel safe in the world anymore, and the events had turned my perception of the wild from something beautiful into something threatening. What had started as an innocent getaway had turned into a nightmare that I'd never be able to forget. The ranger's shout had been a warning about the bear, but in a twisted way, it had saved my life. The murderer never showed his face again. But I'd learned one thing for sure. In the wilderness, you never know what's lurking just around the corner. It was a crisp fall evening, and I had set up camp alone in the Sierra Nevadas. The mountains in this part of California were beautiful, but they could also be unforgiving, especially as the temperature dropped at night. I've been hiking and hunting in these mountains for years, so I felt comfortable out there, confident in my skills and my ability to handle the wilderness. I'd spent the day trekking up to a quiet spot, far from the beaten path, setting up my tent, and getting ready for a peaceful night of sleep. Nothing out of the ordinary had happened until that night. I had just finished a small dinner over the campfire and crawled into my tent, settling into my sleeping bag as the temperature dropped. The fire's crackle was replaced by a stillness that seemed to wrap the entire campsite. The kind of stillness that makes you feel like the forest has gone quiet, almost like everything's holding its breath. I lay there for what seemed like hours, listening to the wind rustling the leaves and the distant calls of owls. I kept thinking about how peaceful it was, how everything felt right, and how I had earned this solitude after days of hiking. But as the night wore on, something began to change. The air grew heavier, the kind of silence that settled into your chest. It was strange, almost unnatural, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. I thought maybe it was the wind playing tricks on me at first. I'd heard it before, how it can make trees creak and leaves move in ways that don't make sense. But then I heard it, that sound, heavy breathing, clear and distinct, as if someone was standing just outside my tent, taking slow, deliberate breaths. It wasn't like the panting of a hiker or an animal trying to catch its breath. It was deeper, more forceful, like something larger was standing in the dark, its chest rising and falling with each breath. I froze, barely breathing myself. My pulse started to race. My ears were straining to catch every sound in the night. The breathing was loud enough to wake me up, but it wasn't so loud that it felt like it was inside the tent. It was just outside, too close for comfort, too controlled. I slowly reached for the shotgun that lay beside me in my tent. I had brought it with me because while I was used to handling animals, I knew the mountains could be dangerous. Bears, mountain lions, predators that could smell you from miles away, could show up uninvited. But this was different. There was no rustling of bushes, no sound of footsteps, just breathing. I sat up and slowly pointed the shotgun in the direction of the sound, waiting for something, anything, to break the silence. My fingers were trembling slightly, but I kept the barrel steady. I knew this wasn't a time to panic. In these kinds of situations, you don't make noise, you don't rush. You wait and observe. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing but the sound of that breathing. I didn't dare move or make a sound. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my heart thudded loudly in my chest. But I tried to focus. Could be a bear, I thought. Maybe a large one, close enough that I hadn't noticed it until now. But the more I listened, the more I realized this wasn't right. The breathing didn't sound like an animal. It was too intentional, too deliberate. It was almost like something was sizing me up, deciding whether or not I was worth the risk. I checked the gun's safety, trying to steady my breath. I couldn't afford to make a mistake. This wasn't the kind of situation where you could pull the trigger without being absolutely sure. I waited and waited. The seconds dragged on, stretching into minutes. Every second felt like an hour. It was as if the whole forest was holding its breath along with me. The breathing never stopped. Each exhale seemed to echo louder in the quiet of the night, filling up the space around me. Eventually, the sound stopped, just like that. 1 second it was there, and the next it was gone. I couldn't hear it fading away, just a sudden, abrupt silence. My body was frozen, my hands still gripping the shotgun, but my mind was racing. What the hell was that? It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a mountain lion. I was sure of that. It wasn't a person either. I hadn't heard footsteps, and there was no sound of clothing moving or anything like that. It was just breathing. The silence stretched on. I still didn't move. I didn't want to make a sound. My ears were straining, my senses heightened, but I heard nothing. No other animals, no rustling, no more breathing. Just the chill of the night air against the tent, the distant sound of the wind, and the feeling of something still watching me, waiting. Minutes passed. Maybe 3, maybe 5. I didn't dare check my watch. I had no idea how long I stayed frozen in that position, shotgun trained on the dark, but every second felt like an eternity. Eventually, I knew I had to make a decision. I couldn't stay like this forever, but I wasn't about to step outside, not with the possibility of whatever it was still out there. I stayed in my tent the rest of the night, eyes wide open, listening for any movement. But there was nothing, not a single sound. The breathing never came back. I didn't even hear a twig snap. The forest had returned to its normal state of eerie quiet. The night dragged on. I didn't sleep, not even a little bit. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear the smallest sound, and my eyes would snap open again. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the first light of day finally crept into the tent, I slowly unzipped it, keeping my gun close. I peered out into the campsite, my heart still racing, scanning the area. But there was nothing, no sign of anything unusual. No footprints, no broken branches. My camp was exactly how I had left it. I spent the next few hours walking around the area, looking for any signs of disturbance. But nothing. It was like the whole thing had never happened. No tracks, no animal signs, no broken trees, nothing. I packed up my gear and left quickly. I didn't stay another night. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was still out there, watching. Maybe it was a bear or some other large animal, but I couldn't figure out why it had been so still. It was as if it had been waiting for me to make a move, or maybe it had been testing me. Whatever it was, it had left no trace behind. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. As an experienced hunter who's dealt with bears before, I know what their breathing sounds like, and this wasn't it. It was something else, something bigger, something more calculating. But I don't know what it was, and that's what scares me the most. I'll never forget that night. The sound of heavy breathing, the feeling of something large and unseen just outside my tent, and the total silence that followed. I don't know if I'll ever go back to that spot again. The trail was eerily quiet that late fall afternoon, with the leaves underfoot crunching softly as I made my way up the mountain. The air was cold, chilly enough that I could see my breath in the stillness of the forest. I was alone, just me and my dog, Macy, a big black lab who was more of a companion than a pet. We were a solid team, having hiked together for years, but today, something felt different. There was a heaviness to the quiet, something off in the crisp air that I couldn't quite place. I had been hiking for several hours now, and the steep, winding path was beginning to take its toll. The trail wound up the side of the mountain in tight switchbacks, and the higher I climbed, the colder it got. The late afternoon light had already begun to dip behind the mountain peaks, casting long shadows over the trail. The trees, mostly tall pines, stood in dense clusters, their needles a deep green, but the forest felt stark and empty. Macy, who usually led the way or stayed close by, was trailing a little behind, occasionally stopping to sniff at the ground or investigate something off the trail. She was a smart dog, the kind who could sense things before I could. I admired that about her, but today, she seemed more on edge than usual. I chalked it up to the cool weather and the isolation of the trail. It wasn't uncommon for me to go hiking alone, but this time, the feeling of being watched was palpable. I had planned to reach a campsite a few more miles up the trail, but the day was slipping away, and I decided to take a break. My legs were burning from the steep climb, and my breath came in heavy gasps. I found a flat spot along the side of the trail, a small clearing surrounded by thick trees. The wind had picked up, but it wasn't strong enough to shake the trees, just a quiet whisper through the needles. I sat down on a flat rock, unzipping my backpack and pulling out a small thermos of water. Macy sat beside me, her head turned to the side, scanning the trail. I took a long drink, feeling the cold liquid trickle down my throat, and let my eyes drift around the quiet forest. It was peaceful here, in a way that made you feel small, like you were nothing more than a speck in a vast ancient landscape. As I leaned back against a tree and closed my eyes for a moment, I heard something that made me snap to attention. Footsteps. Not just any footsteps, but the distinct sound of boots crunching over the trail behind me. I straightened up, heart picking up speed, and turned to look over my shoulder. Two men were coming down the trail toward me. I'd been on trails like this enough to know that hikers usually gave a friendly wave or a nod when passing, especially when it was a quiet afternoon with so few people around. I didn't think much of it at first, but then one of the men spoke as they drew nearer. "You're alone?" he asked, his voice cutting through the stillness. I nodded stiffly, unsure of how to respond. Something in the way he said it made my skin prickle. It was as though he wasn't just acknowledging my solitude, he was almost testing it. The two men exchanged a quick glance, and the one who'd spoken to me smiled at his friend. The smile wasn't warm. It wasn't friendly. It was too wide, too knowing, as if he knew something I didn't. My stomach lurched, and I immediately felt a knot tighten in my chest. I tried to brush off the feeling, reminding myself that not everyone who acts strange is a threat, but that primal instinct was already kicking in. Macy, who had been lying down next to me, suddenly stood up, her tail stiff, her ears pointing forward. Her eyes locked onto the two men, her body language shifting from relaxed to something more alert and protective. I didn't have to say a word. Macy could sense my discomfort, and she always had my back. She looked intimidating, even though she was the sweetest dog in the world. Her massive frame, her dark, intense eyes. She could easily give off the vibe of a guard dog. The two men's demeanor changed instantly. The one who had spoken to me pulled back slightly, his smile fading as he gave Macy a nervous glance. They both exchanged another look, and without another word, they hurried on down the trail, their footsteps quick and hurried as they disappeared around a bend. I stayed perfectly still for a moment, trying to shake the eerie feeling crawling up my spine. What had just happened? Had I misread the situation? I wasn't sure, but something about it didn't sit right. Macy's posture softened, but she stayed close to me, her eyes still trained on the path where the men had disappeared. She wasn't letting her guard down, and that made me uneasy. I trusted her instincts, but now I couldn't help but wonder if they had been planning something. I took a deep breath, standing up slowly. It was getting colder, and I needed to find a place to camp for the night. I decided to take a detour. Instead of heading up the trail to the more obvious campsite, I veered off into a lesser-known area, hoping that a less traveled spot might offer some peace. It was a bit of a risk, but I didn't feel comfortable staying on the main path now. The trail I followed was less defined, the ground uneven and rocky. The trees around me grew thicker, and the sounds of the forest seemed to close in, muffling the outside world. Macy walked in front of me, her nose twitching as she followed the scent of the forest, but she stayed close. I eventually found a small, secluded clearing just off the trail, a quiet spot that was hidden from the main path. There was a stream nearby, and the sound of the water running over the rocks was soothing. I set up my tent quickly, my hands shaking slightly as I worked to make sure everything was secure. As the sun dipped lower, the shadows grew longer, and the temperature continued to drop. I got a fire going and sat by it, trying to shake off the nerves that had settled in my stomach. Macy lay beside me, her head resting on her paws, but she was still alert, her eyes scanning the forest around us. The fire crackled, the warmth from the flames spreading through the cool evening air. Despite the calm of the night, I couldn't fully relax. My mind kept replaying the moment with the two men, the look in their eyes, and the way they had seemed to size me up. It was unsettling, and though I tried to convince myself it was nothing, I knew better. I stayed up late that night, sitting by the fire, my eyes flicking to every rustle in the bushes, every movement in the shadows. Macy stayed close, and I felt safer with her beside me. As the hours passed, the night deepened, and the forest grew quieter. Eventually, I couldn't keep my eyes open any longer, and I retreated to my tent. I lay there, wide awake, staring at the ceiling of the tent. The sound of Macy's soft breathing next to me was a small comfort, but I kept hearing noises outside, twigs snapping, the faint rustling of leaves. Could have been animals, it could have been the wind, but it felt too deliberate. I kept my hand close to my knife, just in case. I don't know when I finally fell asleep, but I woke early the next morning, before the sun had even begun to rise. The forest was still and cold, the ground frosty with the first signs of early winter. I packed up my camp quickly, my nerves still on edge. I didn't want to stay another night in that spot, and I wasn't sure if I could bring myself to continue up the mountain. Something about the whole situation felt wrong. I made my way back down the trail the next morning, the sun rising slowly behind me. I kept my eyes on the path ahead, determined not to let my thoughts wander back to the men I had passed. But even as the daylight grew stronger and the warmth of the sun began to spread, that feeling of being watched didn't go away. I didn't know what they had planned or what they wanted, but I was sure of one thing. I was glad Macy had been there with me. If she hadn't stood up and made herself known, I don't know how the situation would have played out. I was thankful to be heading back down the trail, back toward the safety of the parking lot and the car, but I knew I would never forget that feeling of something not quite right. It was late autumn, the kind of evening when daylight quickly fades, and the night arrives so suddenly you hardly notice it until it's too late. The air had that crisp chill that would become familiar in the coming weeks, but for now, it still held the scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. I was 16, walking the road back to my parents' house after spending the evening with a few friends in the nearby town. It had been a quiet day with nothing out of the ordinary, but as I walked back home, a sense of unease started to creep up on me. The road was familiar to me, one I had walked countless times before. The winding, narrow path was surrounded by dense woods on both sides. It wasn't much of a main road, just a dirt path with a few houses scattered along it. My parents' house, tucked into the countryside, was about a kilometer away at that point. I could already see the faint silhouette of the house in the distance, its lights barely visible against the darkening sky. It was getting dark fast. I checked my watch and it was almost 7 p.m. The light was fading, and the trees around me seemed to absorb what little light remained. I was accustomed to walking this stretch of road, and though I always enjoyed the solitude, tonight there was something different in the air. Perhaps it was the sharpness of the evening air, or the way the trees seemed to sway ominously in the wind. It wasn't enough to scare me, but it was enough to make me feel aware. As I continued walking, my footsteps crunching softly on the gravel path, I noticed something ahead of me, a flicker of light. At first, I thought it might be from a car coming down the road, but as I walked closer, I realized it wasn't from a vehicle. It was a lantern, or at least what appeared to be one. I could see it clearly now, hanging from what looked like a person's hand. The person was standing just on the other side of the road, near the woods. I couldn't make out any details, just a faint silhouette in the dark, and the small, bright light in their hand. The kind of light that seemed to cut through the darkness like a knife. It wasn't like a flashlight, more like an old-fashioned lantern, casting a soft yellow glow in the fading twilight. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I continued walking toward it. My first thought was that it might be someone just out for a walk, maybe someone who lived nearby. But there was something odd about the whole thing. For one, it wasn't common to see people out here at this time of night. Most of the houses in this area were spread far apart, and the people who lived here typically didn't come out in the dark for a stroll. And the way the person was standing, unmoving, felt strange. I tried to shake off the feeling that was building up in my chest. It was probably nothing. Maybe someone was just walking their dog or taking a shortcut through the woods. But I couldn't stop staring at that light. It seemed to draw my gaze like a magnet. As I got closer, something changed. The person, if it was even a person, suddenly raised the lantern, pointing the light directly at me. It was almost like they were aiming it at my face. The beam of light hit me square in the eyes. For a moment, I stopped walking, confused, unsure of what was happening. My heart started to race as I felt the heat of the light in my eyes, blinding me. It wasn't the typical flash of a headlamp or a passing car's headlights. It was steady, purposeful. They were shining it right at me, and for a few seconds, I could do nothing but stand there, frozen, staring into the brightness. Then, as quickly as it had been raised, the light turned off. The darkness immediately consumed the road again, leaving me with nothing but the sound of my own breathing and the wind rustling through the trees. The person, or whatever it was, vanished into the dark as though they had never been there. The light went out and they disappeared just like that. For a split second, I stood there, completely unsure of what to do. My mind raced with questions. Who was that? Why had they pointed the lantern at me? It didn't make any sense. It wasn't like I'd done anything to attract attention, and I didn't know anyone who would be out there with a lantern at this time of night. Then, something in my brain snapped. Instinct kicked in. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I turned on my heel and started running. I wasn't sure if I was actually in danger, but something told me that the safest thing to do was get as far away from whatever that was as fast as possible. My heart pounded in my chest as I sprinted down the road, my shoes slapping against the gravel, my breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. The path was familiar, but it was now an obstacle, a winding route that twisted and turned, the trees on either side creating dark, almost suffocating walls. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was behind me, that whoever had been standing there in the dark was following me. I kept running, faster and faster, my legs burning with the effort, my lungs screaming for air. I didn't stop. I didn't dare look back. I didn't even know how far I had run until I saw the faint glow of the porch lights from my parents' house up ahead. It felt like I'd been running for an eternity, but in reality, it was only a minute or two. When I finally reached the gate, I slammed it open, ran up the driveway, and threw open the front door without thinking. I stood there in the doorway, gasping for breath, trying to calm my racing heart. My parents were in the living room watching TV. I didn't even know what to say. I didn't know how to explain what had just happened. I tried to shake off the fear, but it lingered, settling into my bones like a cold that wouldn't go away. I didn't tell them about the lantern, about the strange person, or about the fear that had gripped me as I ran. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it had been nothing. But something about that moment, about the way the light had been aimed at me and then snuffed out without a sound, stayed with me. It wasn't until much later, when I had calmed down and could think about it more clearly, that I realized something else. There was no way that person had been there. No one lived that far down the road, and it was so dark out there, no one could walk without being seen from a distance. The nearest house was over 1 kilometer away. I had been alone on that stretch of road, and I had never seen anyone else around. I still don't know who or what that person was, but I do know this. I'll never walk down that road at night again. Something about it didn't feel right, and I trusted my instincts enough to know that it was better to be safe than sorry. That night, I went to bed with the blinds drawn tight, and I didn't look out the window again. Whatever had been standing there in the dark, waiting, had stayed there until I was far enough away. And as I lay there, I realized something. I wasn't afraid of the dark. I wasn't afraid of the woods, but I was afraid of what might be lurking in it, watching from the shadows. The lantern, I never saw it again, but the memory of that light, aimed directly at me, stays with me to this day. Sometimes, when I walk that road in daylight, I still find myself glancing into the trees, half expecting to see that strange flicker of light once more. I don't know who was out there or why, but I'll never forget how it felt to be watched in the dark. It's a feeling I can't shake, and probably never will.